When British soldiers entered Bergen-Belsen in 1945, they walked into a nightmare no human eye was meant to see. Behind rows of barbed wire and wooden guard towers stood a camp whose very name would come to symbolize starvation, disease, and unimaginable suffering. Unlike other camps, it was not built with gas chambers or crematoria at first, but rather became a place where tens of thousands of prisoners, Jews, political captives, prisoners of war, and countless others were left to wither away in horrific conditions. Here, typhus raged unchecked, food was scarce, and bodies piled high as humanity was stripped to its core. Even Anne Frank, whose diary captured the spirit of so many silenced voices, met her tragic end within these fences. When British troops finally liberated the camp in April 1945, what they discovered shocked the world: mass graves, skeletal survivors, and a scene of devastation so profound it would forever mark history. This is the entire story of Bergen-Belsen, its creation, its horrors, its liberation, and the lasting scars it left upon the conscience of mankind. So close your eyes, settle in, and let this haunting yet vital history unfold as you drift into sleep. And before we begin, share in the comments where you are tuning in from and what time it is there, because together, across oceans and generations, we keep history alive. The story of Bergen-Belsen begins not with the horrors for which it later became infamous, but with a seemingly unremarkable military installation. In the late 1930s, the German Wehrmacht identified a stretch of heathland near the villages of Bergen and Belsen, situated in Lower Saxony, as a suitable location for a military training area. This land, remote and sparsely populated, had long been used for garrison exercises, artillery training, and maneuvers, giving the German army ample space to expand operations. With the outbreak of the Second World War in 1939, the demand for prisoner-of-war facilities rapidly increased, as German forces captured thousands of soldiers from the campaigns in Poland and France. It was within this context in 1940 that Bergen-Belsen's barracks were repurposed into a prisoner-of-war camp under Wehrmacht control. Initially, the structures erected were crude temporary huts and makeshift compounds, lacking any consideration for human comfort or survival. The German military planners did not foresee the site becoming a focal point of mass suffering, but rather treated it as an expedient holding ground. Barbed wire perimeters were set, guard towers erected, and the camp was placed under the jurisdiction of Wehrmacht officers tasked with the orderly containment of enemy soldiers. The early years of Bergen-Belsen's existence were thus tied closely to the rhythms of military bureaucracy and strategic wartime necessities, rather than the systematic destruction that would later follow. Yet, even in these origins, the seeds of brutality were present, for neglect and indifference quickly gave way to conditions of deprivation and misery. The first prisoners to arrive at Bergen-Belsen in 1940 were predominantly French and Belgian soldiers captured during the German offensives in Western Europe. They were herded into overcrowded wooden barracks, each one hastily constructed to accommodate far more men than it reasonably could. The rations provided were meagre, often consisting of watery soups, coarse bread, and occasional scraps of meat, wholly insufficient for the needs of exhausted and undernourished captives. Sanitation facilities were rudimentary, limited to open latrines that soon overflowed, turning the camp into a breeding ground for lice, fleas, and disease. The German guards, hardened by the ideology of superiority and fueled by disdain for defeated enemies, treated the prisoners with a mixture of neglect and casual cruelty. Punishments for minor infractions were severe, ranging from beatings to prolonged standing at attention in freezing conditions. Prisoners were also subjected to forced labor, constructing additional barracks, clearing land, and improving the military infrastructure of the site. For many, Bergen-Belsen was not yet the notorious death trap it would later become, but survival was nonetheless precarious. hinging on endurance, comradeship, and the faint hope of Red Cross parcels. Families back home often remained unaware of their loved ones' suffering, as official communications painted a sanitized picture of conditions in German POW camps. Already, a pattern of neglect had set in, one that would only deepen as the camp expanded and its purpose shifted in the years to come. By 1941, the character of Bergen-Belsen began to change with the German invasion of the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa. Suddenly, tens of thousands of Soviet prisoners of war poured into Germany, overwhelming the existing network of camps. The Wehrmacht, driven by Nazi ideology that regarded Slavic soldiers as racially inferior, subjected these Soviet captives to far harsher treatment than Western European prisoners. Bergen-Belsen became one of the designated sites to house this massive influx, and its barracks, already stretched thin, became dangerously overcrowded. Conditions deteriorated rapidly, as hundreds of men were crammed into facilities meant for a fraction of their number, with no additional resources or provisions provided. The food rations were deliberately reduced, reflecting the German policy of starvation towards Soviet POWs. Death rates skyrocketed, with diseases like dysentery, typhus, and pneumonia spreading unchecked in the cold, damp quarters. Many Soviet soldiers perished within weeks of arrival, their bodies buried in mass graves hastily dug in the surrounding fields. The guards displayed indifference to this suffering, often leaving corpses uncollected for days, turning the camp into a scene of constant decay. What began as a military detention facility was quickly transforming into a site of systematic neglect, foreshadowing the horrors to come. The strategic importance of Bergen-Belsen as a POW camp lay partly in its location. Positioned between Hanover and Hamburg, it was within reach of major railway lines that connected it to the larger network of camps scattered across Germany and occupied Europe. This accessibility allowed the authorities to transport prisoners in and out with relative ease, making Bergen-Belsen a logistical hub as much as a holding site. Trainloads of exhausted, wounded, and half-starved men would arrive, often after days of brutal travel in sealed cattle cars with little food or water. Those who survived the journey were thrust directly into the camp's worsening conditions, where they encountered disease, hunger, and despair. The infrastructure of the camp, primitive huts, open latrines, and sparse medical care, was wholly unprepared to handle such numbers, yet no attempt was made to improve facilities. Instead, the neglect was institutionalized, with camp authorities recording deaths as routine administrative entries. The stench of death hung in the air, drifting across the surrounding heathland, while villagers nearby whispered of what was occurring behind the barbed wire. The transformation from barracks to prison camp was complete, yet it was only the beginning of Bergen-Belsen's descent into infamy. For within a few short years, its role would shift again, this time under the SS, bringing with it an even darker chapter in its history. Life for the prisoners in these early years revolved around survival under the constant threat of starvation and disease. Men fought over scraps of bread, bartered personal belongings for morsels of food, and clung to the smallest comforts, such as a blanket or an extra pair of shoes. The camp's daily routine was rigidly enforced: roll calls at dawn, hours of forced labor, and frequent inspections by guards who showed little concern for the prisoners' physical decline. Medical care was virtually non-existent, with only a handful of camp medics and no proper supplies to treat the waves of illness that swept through the barracks. Wounds festered untreated, while contagious diseases like tuberculosis claimed lives with grim regularity. In these conditions, camaraderie among prisoners often became the only shield against despair, with small groups forming to share food, guard against theft, or provide emotional support. Yet even solidarity was strained, as hunger eroded trust and desperation drove men to betray one another for the faintest chance of survival. Letters home, when permitted, were censored, stripped of any detail that might reveal the reality of camp life. Official German propaganda portrayed Bergen-Belsen as a standard POW facility, but those trapped inside knew it was already sliding into something far more sinister. The barracks that had once housed soldiers were now becoming cages of suffering, marking the camp as a place where life was cheap and death routine. The German officers overseeing Bergen-Belsen in its early years were drawn largely from the Wehrmacht's administrative ranks, men accustomed to discipline but not trained in humanitarian oversight. Their focus was on efficiency and order, not on the well-being of the prisoners under their control. The ideological indoctrination of the Nazi regime further shaped their attitudes, encouraging them to view prisoners, especially those from the Soviet Union, as expendable and undeserving of care. Brutality, however, was not always overt. More often it was expressed through neglect, indifference, and deliberate withholding of resources. Requests for increased food rations or medical supplies were routinely denied, with the rationale that prisoners of war did not merit investment during wartime scarcity. Guards were instructed to prevent escapes at all costs, but otherwise left prisoners to waste away inside the wire. The moral collapse that characterized Bergen-Belsen in later years was already visible in these moments, as small decisions of indifference compounded into a system of suffering. Even those who might have felt unease were silenced by orders, career ambition, or fear of reprisal. In this atmosphere, Bergen-Belsen's foundation as a place of misery was firmly laid, awaiting only the shift to SS control to unleash its full horror. The camp had begun as a barracks, but by 1941 it had become a prison of despair. As word of conditions inside Bergen-Belsen began to circulate, international organizations like the Red Cross attempted to intervene. Reports of disease, hunger, and mass deaths among Soviet POWs reached neutral governments, sparking concerns about Germany's adherence to international conventions. The Wehrmacht, sensitive to its public image and eager to avoid diplomatic crises, occasionally permitted inspections, but these visits were carefully staged. Barracks would be cleaned, rations temporarily improved, and the sick hidden away to present a misleading picture of camp life. Prisoners were instructed to remain silent or coached on what to say, under threat of punishment should they speak the truth. These orchestrated visits reassured foreign observers, allowing the camp to continue operating with little external interference. Meanwhile, behind the facade, conditions continued to deteriorate, with daily deaths mounting into the hundreds during the harsh winters. The gulf between reality and presentation was stark, as Bergen-Belsen began to embody the broader Nazi pattern of deception and concealment. International protest was muted, partly because information was scarce, and partly because the world was consumed by the wider chaos of war. Thus, Bergen-Belsen's evolution from barracks to prison camp continued largely unchecked, hidden beneath layers of lies and indifference. By the end of 1941, Bergen-Belsen stood at a crossroads in its development, no longer a mere extension of Wehrmacht military operations, but not yet the SS-controlled concentration camp it would soon become. Its history as a site of neglect, overcrowding, and suffering had already marked it as a place of torment for thousands of POWs, particularly the Soviet soldiers who perished in staggering numbers. The barracks, once built to house German troops, had become symbols of human degradation, their wooden walls soaked with the misery of those confined within. The land surrounding the camp bore silent witness, with mass graves dug hastily to conceal the mounting dead. What had begun as a practical military installation was steadily morphing into something more sinister, shaped by the lethal combination of ideology, indifference, and expedience. The local population lived with whispers and rumors, seeing transports arrive and smoke rise, yet powerless or unwilling to confront what was happening. For the prisoners themselves, the camp was a world unto itself, severed from the outside, defined only by hunger, fear, and survival. Bergen-Belsen's origin story, therefore, is not one of inevitability, but of choices, choices made by commanders, guards, and a regime that saw human life as expendable. This foundation would soon be built upon with even greater cruelty, as the SS arrived to transform Bergen-Belsen into one of the most notorious camps in the Nazi system. The barracks had become a prison, and the prison was preparing to become a nightmare. By 1943, Bergen-Belsen underwent a transformation that would define its dark legacy, shifting from a Wehrmacht-run prisoner of war camp to a concentration camp under the direct control of the SS. Heinrich Himmler, Reichsführer SS, ordered the camp's transfer as part of the larger Nazi strategy to centralize and intensify the system of forced labor, detention, and extermination across occupied Europe. The military barracks, previously designed to house prisoners of war, were retrofitted for the imprisonment of Jews, political prisoners, Roma, and other groups targeted by the Nazi regime. The infrastructure, already crude and overcrowded, was expanded with additional wooden huts, barbed wire fences, and watchtowers, all under strict SS surveillance. Camp guards now followed strict SS protocols, trained in ideological indoctrination, and instructed to enforce terror through punishment, humiliation, and neglect. Medical facilities were minimal and designed not for healing, but for experimentation and quarantine to prevent the spread of disease among prisoners deemed fit for labor. Transport schedules were altered to accommodate the arrival of trains from across Germany and occupied territories, bringing in inmates from other camps and ghettos. The barracks that once housed soldiers and POWs were now overcrowded with civilians, women, children, and the elderly, with little thought to hygiene or sanitation. From this moment, Bergen-Belsen transitioned from a site of military pragmatism to a hub of systematic human suffering, a reflection of the SS's ruthless efficiency. The change was both physical and administrative, with the camp now fully integrated into the machinery of Nazi oppression. The first wave of Jewish prisoners began arriving in late 1943, many of them deported from occupied Eastern Europe, particularly Poland. These transports, packed into cramped cattle cars, brought individuals who had already endured weeks of starvation, disease, and abuse. Upon arrival, prisoners were subjected to brutal registration processes, including shaving of hair, confiscation of personal belongings, and assignment to overcrowded barracks without heating or bedding. Disease spread rapidly among these new arrivals, as typhus, dysentery, and scabies thrived in the unsanitary conditions. The SS, following Himmler's directives, deliberately allowed overcrowding and filth to weaken prisoners, simultaneously reducing the need for food and labor resources. Guards enforced strict rules with violent punishments for even minor infractions, maintaining control through terror and fear. The camp's perimeter was expanded to include additional fences and guard towers, further isolating inmates from the outside world. Prisoners were forced into manual labor, clearing land, constructing new huts, and maintaining the barbed wire perimeter. Each day was a struggle for survival, with hunger and disease claiming more victims than direct violence in the early months of SS administration. Bergen-Belsen was now no longer a temporary holding ground, but a permanent site of imprisonment, suffering, and death. One of the most immediate changes brought by SS control was the institutionalization of neglect as a deliberate policy. Food rations were severely limited, often consisting of watery soup, black bread, and a small portion of margarine, calculated to sustain minimal energy for forced labor. Those unable to perform work due to sickness or exhaustion were left to fend for themselves, accelerating mortality rates. Latrines remained inadequate, overcrowded, and unsanitary, allowing disease to spread with terrifying efficiency. Medical care, ostensibly provided by camp doctors, was largely superficial. Treatment was reserved for prisoners deemed useful, while the weak were condemned to die. The SS also imposed brutal disciplinary measures, including floggings, standing in freezing conditions, and execution for perceived resistance or escape attempts. Prisoners were crammed into wooden barracks designed to hold far fewer people than they contained, leaving little room to lie down or even sit. Ventilation was poor, and the cold winter months brought suffering and frostbite. The psychological toll was equally severe, as prisoners witnessed the suffering and deaths of their friends, neighbors, and family members. With the SS at the helm, Bergen-Belsen evolved into a place where deprivation and terror were as lethal as bullets, shaping a new reality of incarceration. The arrival of prisoners from other camps in 1944 further strained Bergen-Belsen's resources and conditions. Jews evacuated from Auschwitz and other extermination camps, often sick and emaciated, were sent to Bergen-Belsen as part of Nazi attempts to consolidate labor forces and manage overcrowding. These transfers brought waves of typhus and other communicable diseases, overwhelming the minimal medical facilities. Barracks intended for a few dozen now housed hundreds, with prisoners sleeping in shifts to survive. Starvation became pervasive, and scarcities of clean water compounded the crisis. The SS guards, now fully indoctrinated in Himmler's racial ideology, treated new arrivals with immediate suspicion and cruelty, using intimidation and violence to maintain control. Women, children, and the elderly were particularly vulnerable, often segregated in separate sections of the camp with even harsher conditions. Inmates were forced to stand for hours during roll calls, perform grueling labor in freezing weather, and witness brutal punishments administered to others as a constant reminder of authority. The camp, once a prison for soldiers, now became a microcosm of the wider Nazi policy of extermination through neglect, terror, and forced labor. Bergen-Belsen's identity as a concentration camp was cemented, its infamy growing even as the outside world remained largely unaware of the scale of suffering. Daily life under SS rule was defined by routine brutality, with prisoners subjected to a regimen that stripped away dignity and humanity. Hunger drove prisoners to desperation, forcing them to scavenge for food scraps, barter personal belongings, or steal from one another in a struggle to survive. Sanitation remained appallingly poor, with overflowing latrines and contaminated water spreading typhus, dysentery, and other deadly diseases. The camp commandant enforced strict adherence to roll calls, labor quotas, and barracks inspections, punishing any perceived weakness or disobedience. Prisoners were routinely forced to perform physically demanding labor for long hours in extreme weather, often without adequate clothing or shoes. Those who fell ill were isolated or left to die, as SS ideology deemed them unworthy of care. Morale deteriorated rapidly, and despair became a constant companion, amplified by the absence of news from the outside world. Despite these conditions, small acts of solidarity and compassion sometimes emerged among prisoners, offering brief reprieves from the relentless suffering. The combination of hunger, disease, forced labor, and psychological terror created an environment designed to break the human spirit. Bergen-Belsen under the SS had become an efficient instrument of human degradation, far removed from its original purpose as a military detention facility. The camp's administration was now firmly under the SS hierarchy, with directives flowing from Berlin to the commandant and guards stationed throughout Bergen-Belsen. Heinrich Himmler's vision for the concentration camp system emphasized strict order, racial ideology, and the use of forced labor for the war effort. Records were meticulously kept, documenting prisoner intake, labor assignments, and mortality rates, reflecting the bureaucratic precision of Nazi cruelty. Yet these records masked the true human cost, reducing lives to mere numbers on forms. Roll calls were a daily spectacle of suffering, with prisoners forced to stand for hours in the mud or snow, often with the dead or dying in their midst. Surveillance was relentless, with guards patrolling the barbed wire perimeter and watchtowers monitoring every movement. Punishments for perceived infractions ranged from beatings to death, reinforcing a climate of fear and submission. Prisoners had little autonomy, their existence dictated by the whims of camp authorities and the rigid ideology of the SS. Even the smallest acts of resistance were met with swift and brutal reprisal, cementing the camp's reputation as a place of absolute control. Bergen-Belsen's transformation was now complete, a stark symbol of the SS's systematic machinery of terror. In addition to housing Jews, political prisoners, and other marginalized groups, Bergen-Belsen became a site for displaced prisoners from other camps evacuated ahead of the advancing Allies. These transfers brought waves of severely weakened individuals, many suffering from the physical and psychological trauma of prior camps. The influx exacerbated the already dire conditions, with overcrowding reaching critical levels, food and medical supplies stretched to the breaking point, and disease spreading uncontrollably. The SS maintained a facade of efficiency, conducting registrations and roll calls, yet their policies ensured that death and suffering were inescapable for the most vulnerable. Women particularly faced extreme hardship, confined to barracks with insufficient bedding, clothing, and food. Children, separated from families during transport, were left in the care of older prisoners, struggling to survive in the absence of adult protection. Guards enforced labor quotas with ruthless precision, using whips, clubs, and firearms to maintain compliance. The camp's layout, designed for maximum control, created sections of isolation where disease and death multiplied unseen by outsiders. Psychological terror compounded physical deprivation, with constant threat of punishment, humiliation, and death reinforcing the prisoner's powerlessness. Bergen-Belsen had become not merely a prison, but a complex instrument of the SS's genocidal policy. By the end of 1943, Bergen-Belsen had fully transitioned from a Wehrmacht POW facility to a notorious SS concentration camp, its identity redefined by systemic cruelty, neglect, and terror. The barracks, once intended for soldiers, now confined thousands of civilians and prisoners from across Europe, many of them emaciated, ill, and traumatized. Disease ran rampant, food was deliberately scarce, and daily life was a battle against exhaustion, hunger, and despair. The camp's administration, under the meticulous direction of the SS, combined bureaucracy with brutality, reducing human beings to numbers in registers while enforcing strict control through fear. The transformation was not only physical. In the summer of 1941, following Hitler's invasion of the Soviet Union under Operation Barbarossa, Bergen-Belsen received its first major influx of human captives, thousands of Soviet prisoners of war. These men had been captured in staggering numbers as the German war machine pushed rapidly into the vast expanse of the Soviet Union, surrounding and swallowing entire Red Army divisions. Transported westward in overcrowded cattle cars, many perished before even reaching the gates of Bergen-Belsen. Those who did survive the journey arrived emaciated, exhausted, and disoriented, stripped of their uniforms and dignity. The Wehrmacht, following Nazi ideological directives, viewed them as racially inferior, treating them as expendable labor rather than soldiers protected under international law. Once inside the camp, These men encountered a barren compound with inadequate shelter, open-air pens, and hastily assembled barracks, incapable of housing such vast numbers. Little food was distributed, and the meagre rations provided, thin soup and scraps of bread, were deliberately insufficient. In the very earliest days of its operation, Bergen-Belsen was already a place where survival depended less on endurance and more on sheer chance. Conditions deteriorated almost immediately after the Soviet POWs began arriving in waves. The camp lacked sanitation facilities, and men were crammed into wooden huts designed to hold only a fraction of their numbers. Bedding was non-existent, forcing prisoners to sleep on damp wooden planks or directly on the floor, shoulder to shoulder in suffocating darkness. Dysentery, typhus, and tuberculosis began to spread within weeks, accelerated by the absence of medical treatment and the constant exposure to filth. Corpses piled up within the barracks, often left unattended for days because guards refused to allow proper disposal until mass burial pits were dug. German guards and officers regarded the deaths not as a tragedy but as an intended outcome, a reflection of Hitler's notorious Commissar order, which declared Soviet POWs as undeserving of mercy. The first winter was particularly brutal, as inadequate clothing and bitter cold claimed thousands more lives. Hunger became the daily torment, with prisoners driven to desperate measures, gnawing on tree bark or chewing on scraps of leather to ease the pangs of starvation. Each day the prisoner count shrank rapidly, with death rates soaring to staggering levels. By early 1942, Bergen-Belsen's reputation as a death sentence for Soviet POWs was firmly established. Mortality rates were catastrophic, with some estimates suggesting that entire shipments of men disappeared within weeks of arrival. The camp infrastructure, originally built for a modest Wehrmacht barracks, simply collapsed under the strain of such numbers. Fresh water was scarce, and many prisoners resorted to drinking from muddy ditches or stagnant puddles, further spreading disease. The SS guards, though not yet fully in charge of Bergen-Belsen, were already involved in selections, singling out those too weak to work and consigning them to death by neglect. Witnesses recalled the skeletal figures who stumbled through the compound, reduced to shadows of men, their eyes glazed and their limbs trembling with weakness. For many, Bergen-Belsen was not just a place of imprisonment, but a prelude to death. Those who managed to endure faced forced labor on nearby military projects, digging trenches, repairing roads, and hauling supplies under constant abuse. This cruel system ensured that even survival meant suffering without reprieve. The Nazi ideological view of Soviet prisoners underpinned the cruelty at Bergen-Belsen. In Hitler's worldview, the Slavic people were considered subhuman, unworthy of the protections guaranteed under the Geneva Conventions. Unlike British or French prisoners of war, who were at least nominally recognized as soldiers, Soviet captives were treated as vermin to be eradicated. Orders from the highest levels of the Nazi command specifically instructed that Soviet POWs were to receive no medical treatment, no sufficient food, and no consideration for survival. Bergen-Belsen became one of the many camps across Germany where these policies were brutally enforced. The camp guards often mocked starving prisoners, throwing scraps of food to watch them fight one another in desperation. Beatings were frequent, with rifles and whips used to maintain control over the weakest men. What emerged was not merely a logistical failure, but a deliberate system of annihilation, cloaked under the guise of wartime necessity. This early stage laid the foundations for the kind of inhuman suffering Bergen-Belsen would soon be infamous for. Survivors' testimonies describe the haunting reality of those first years with harrowing clarity. Men arrived strong but quickly wasted away, their bodies consumed by hunger and disease until they became unrecognizable. Prisoners often spoke of the silence that fell over the barracks as men too weak to speak or move simply awaited death. Many recalled the smell, the overpowering stench of decay as bodies decomposed where they lay, uncollected for days at a time. In some cases, the living and the dead shared the same space, as guards were indifferent to removing corpses until the barracks were overflowing. The atmosphere was one of despair, where hope was extinguished almost instantly upon arrival. Even those accustomed to hardship, hardened soldiers who had survived battles on the Eastern Front, found themselves powerless against the slow grind of starvation and neglect. These first prisoners, stripped of their humanity, became the earliest victims of a system that was only beginning to reveal its true cruelty. The local population around Bergen-Belsen could not entirely ignore what was happening inside the camp. Farmers and townspeople occasionally witnessed skeletal figures shuffling in labor columns or saw trucks loaded with bodies heading toward mass graves. Yet fear and indoctrination kept most silent, and the Wehrmacht maintained a strict barrier of secrecy around the camp's internal conditions. Some Germans may have suspected, but many preferred not to ask questions, content to avert their gaze from the unfolding catastrophe. For the prisoners themselves, this isolation reinforced the sense of abandonment, as no help seemed possible and no rescue imaginable. Letters and communication with the outside world were forbidden, severing all ties to family or hope beyond the camp's barbed wire. In this void of silence, suffering multiplied unchecked, and Bergen-Belsen's grim evolution toward a concentration camp was underway. These early Soviet prisoners became both the test subjects and victims of a machinery of dehumanization that would later expand to engulf Jews and other groups targeted by the Nazis. The suffering of Soviet POWs at Bergen-Belsen mirrored a broader pattern across the Reich, where millions of Red Army soldiers perished in captivity. At Bergen-Belsen, the mortality rates reflected deliberate policy, not logistical mismanagement. The camp became a site where starvation, exposure, and neglect were weaponized as tools of extermination. These deaths were largely invisible to the outside world, overshadowed by the more infamous killing centers that would emerge in occupied Poland. Yet for those within, the horror was no less complete. The Soviet POWs' ordeal marked a chapter of the Holocaust by bullets and starvation, a phase in which the Nazi regime tested its capacity to annihilate large populations under controlled conditions. In this sense, Bergen-Belsen's early history foreshadowed its later transformation, revealing how ideology and practical cruelty intertwined. The lessons drawn by the SS from the suffering of these first prisoners would soon be applied with even greater intensity against Jews, Roma, and political prisoners. By the end of this phase, Bergen-Belsen was already a place synonymous with death and despair. Thousands of Soviet prisoners had perished, their names lost to history, their bodies buried in shallow pits or left to rot in makeshift graveyards. Their suffering provided the grim foundation upon which the camp's later horrors would be built. When the SS took formal control in 1943, they inherited not an empty site, but a place already steeped in brutality and accustomed to mass death. The Soviet POWs' tragic fate demonstrated both the indifference and the deliberate malice of the Nazi system, shaping the trajectory of Bergen-Belsen into one of the most infamous camps in history. These early victims, largely forgotten compared to later inmates, represent the first wave of mass death to sweep through the camp. Their story is essential to understanding the scale of Nazi brutality, the roots of Bergen-Belsen's notoriety, and the chilling progression from military barracks to a site of industrialized human misery. By 1943, Bergen-Belsen was no longer a single uniform facility, but a complex of distinct and segregated sections, each serving a different and often sinister purpose. Under the direction of the SS, the camp expanded into separate compounds, reflecting the Nazi obsession with categorization and control. These divisions were not arbitrary, but designed to separate prisoners by nationality, religion, political status, and utility to the Reich. The largest and most infamous was the so-called Star Camp, where Jewish prisoners were forced to wear the yellow Star of David as part of their designated identity. Another compound, labeled the Neutral Camp, housed Jews who held passports from countries not directly at war with Germany, a cruelly deceptive designation that offered little true protection. In addition, there were camps for exchange Jews, hostages, whom the Nazis hoped to trade for German citizens held abroad or for foreign currency. Political prisoners, including resistance members, were confined separately in conditions deliberately made harsher to break their spirit. Over time, each section became a world of its own, with its own set of rules, deprivations, and horrors. The camp, once a single entity, had become a labyrinth of suffering. The Star Camp was one of the most tragic examples of Nazi deception, a place that carried both the appearance of special treatment and the reality of misery. Here, entire Jewish families were sometimes held together, a rarity in the concentration camp system, but their lives were defined by starvation, overcrowding, and uncertainty. Prisoners were led to believe that they might one day be exchanged for Germans held overseas, giving them a flicker of hope that often proved illusory. In reality, only a small number were ever released through such exchanges, while the vast majority perished in Bergen-Belsen or were later deported to extermination camps like Auschwitz. Conditions inside the Star Camp were far from lenient. Disease spread rapidly, rations were meager, and the looming presence of SS guards reminded prisoners that survival was a matter of chance, not privilege. The yellow stars sewn onto their clothing symbolized not only their identity, but their marked status for suffering. For many, this camp was a cruel limbo between life and death, suspended between false promises and inevitable tragedy. Alongside the Star Camp stood the so-called Neutral Camp, a section reserved for Jews from neutral or non-belligerent countries such as Spain, Portugal, and certain South American nations. These individuals were theoretically afforded a degree of protection under international law, but in practice their treatment was still harsh and degrading. The Nazis used their presence as a bargaining chip, often dangling the possibility of releasing them in diplomatic negotiations. Yet, conditions in this compound differed little from the others. Food was scarce, medical care non-existent, and fear permeated daily life. Families lived in constant uncertainty, unsure whether they would be released, transferred, or simply left to rot in Bergen-Belsen squalor. The neutral camp symbolized the cynical manipulation of human lives for political leverage, reducing entire communities to pawns in Nazi power games. While some few were eventually freed in prisoner exchanges, most endured prolonged suffering behind barbed wire. The camp's existence reflected both the international dimension of Nazi cruelty and the hollow value of neutrality in a world at war. One of the more unusual features of Bergen-Belsen was the exchange camp, a section that housed Jews selected for potential trade. These individuals were often chosen because they held foreign passports or connections that might be useful in negotiations. The Nazis viewed them not as humans, but as commodities, living bargaining chips with which they could extract concessions. In these sections, prisoners clung to the hope that they might be part of a rare exchange deal, but such arrangements were sporadic and heavily limited. The conditions, though marginally better in some respects, were still appalling, with inadequate food, rampant disease, and constant SS oversight. When exchanges did occur, they were celebrated as miracles, but the vast majority of inmates remained trapped, betrayed by promises that were rarely fulfilled. The exchange camp revealed the grotesque ways in which the Nazi system dehumanized individuals, transforming them into tools of political maneuvering. The camp's divisions underscored the regime's ability to exploit human desperation on multiple levels. Beyond the Jewish compounds, Bergen-Belsen also housed political prisoners, individuals accused of resisting Nazi occupation across Europe. These men and women, drawn from countries such as France, the Netherlands, and Poland, were seen as dangerous threats to the Reich's control. Unlike the exchange categories, political prisoners were not bargaining tools. They were enemies to be broken, silenced, or destroyed. Their treatment was especially harsh. Forced labor, starvation rations, and deliberate psychological torment were part of daily life. Many were subjected to brutal interrogations designed to extract information about underground networks. Others were left to languish in overcrowded huts where disease spread unchecked. For these prisoners, Bergen-Belsen was a place of relentless punishment, where survival required extraordinary resilience. Their presence revealed the camp's dual role, both a place of temporary detention and a mechanism for crushing opposition to Nazi rule. As the camp expanded, segregation also extended to smaller groups, reflecting the Nazis' obsession with classification. There were compounds for Roma and Sinti prisoners who faced the same discrimination and hardships as in other camps across occupied Europe. Separate quarters were also set aside for women and children who endured appalling conditions of neglect and cruelty. Even within the camp's confines, the SS enforced hierarchies, dividing prisoners not only by nationality and religion, but also by perceived value to the Reich. This compartmentalization ensured that solidarity was fractured and that prisoners had fewer opportunities to unite against their oppressors. The divisions were deliberate psychological weapons, reinforcing feelings of isolation and helplessness. For the SS, segregation was a method of control as much as an administrative measure. Each barbed wire fence that separated one compound from another was both a physical and symbolic barrier, representing the Nazi regime's relentless drive to dehumanize and divide. The expansion of Bergen-Belsen required not just physical restructuring, but also a bureaucratic machine to manage its growing complexity. SS officers and administrators oversaw the various compounds, issuing rules and regulations designed to keep prisoners in perpetual fear. Capus, often drawn from among the prisoners themselves, were placed in charge of barracks, forced to enforce discipline on their fellow inmates. The system created layers of authority, ensuring that control flowed downward while responsibility for cruelty was dispersed. This administrative structure gave the camp an appearance of order, but beneath the surface it was chaos. Starvation, disease, and despair prevailed in every section. The separation into compounds meant that while thousands of people shared the same space, their experiences were fragmented, preventing a unified understanding of their collective plight. For the prisoners, the expansion deepened the sense of being trapped in a universe with no escape, divided into invisible walls of suffering. By 1944, Bergen-Belsen had transformed into a sprawling complex of misery, its expansion mirroring the widening scope of the Holocaust itself. The divisions into star camps, neutral camps, exchange camps, and political compounds were not signs of diversity, but of systematic cruelty. Each section reflected a different facet of Nazi policy: manipulation, exploitation, suppression, or extermination, all converging in one place. To walk through the camp was to traverse multiple realities, each defined by suffering, yet each uniquely brutal in its own way. The segregation created an illusion of order for the SS, while producing endless torment for those trapped inside. Bergen-Belsen was no longer merely a detention site. It was an engine of despair, carefully organized yet utterly inhumane. The expansion and its segregated compartments stood as a chilling testament to the Nazi regime's ability to weaponize bureaucracy in the service of mass suffering. In the years that followed, these divisions would only intensify the horrors yet to come. Daily life in Bergen-Belsen was defined by deprivation so severe that survival became a fragile thread stretched to its breaking point each day. Prisoners awoke before dawn, summoned by the sharp bark of orders and the shrill blast of whistles, dragged from overcrowded wooden barracks into the cold morning air. Roll calls, known as appel, became dreaded rituals, lasting hours regardless of rain, snow, or biting wind. Men, women, and children alike stood in rigid silence, their frail bodies trembling from exhaustion and lack of clothing. Guards counted and recounted them with methodical precision, punishing even the smallest perceived mistake. Those too weak to stand often collapsed, sometimes trampled by the press of bodies or beaten by the guards. Corpses left from the night were dragged out and lined at the edge of the square, a grim reminder of what awaited the living. Even after this ordeal, prisoners returned to barracks only to face another day of hunger and forced labor. The rhythm of life was not marked by time or seasons, but by survival through these relentless daily trials. For the prisoners, each sunrise offered no hope, only another chance to endure suffering. Food in Bergen-Belsen was a weapon, measured in starvation rations that weakened the body and broke the spirit. Prisoners received watery turnip soup, a crust of mouldy bread, or sometimes nothing at all for an entire day. The bread, often cut into tiny portions to feed several people, was stale and infested with sawdust or straw fillers. On rare occasions, prisoners might receive a small piece of margarine or a sliver of sausage, but these were cruel illusions of nourishment. Hunger became an all-consuming obsession, gnawing at the stomach and clouding the mind with desperation. Inmates scavenged scraps from garbage pits, licked empty bowls, or chewed on grass and bark when despair overwhelmed them. Mothers rationed their meager portions to children, often starving themselves into weakness or death. The lack of calories left prisoners skeletal, their faces hollowed, their skin stretched taut over protruding bones. Starvation was not simply a side effect of imprisonment. It was an intentional policy of annihilation through neglect. Each day without food eroded hope, until even the will to live seemed like a luxury too costly to afford. Forced labor added another layer of suffering to daily life, grinding down bodies already weakened by hunger. Prisoners were compelled to haul heavy loads, dig trenches, or perform endless meaningless tasks, meant only to exhaust them. Many were assigned to clear forests, build roads, or carry stones, despite lacking shoes or proper clothing. The sick and dying were forced to work alongside the able, their weakened frames collapsing under impossible demands. Guards took pleasure in assigning humiliating chores, such as cleaning latrines with bare hands or moving piles of earth back and forth with no purpose. Any hesitation or mistake was met with brutal beatings, kicks, or whippings. For the prisoners, work was not a means of productivity, but another method of degradation and control. The physical toll was devastating, but the psychological damage was just as severe. Every task reinforced the feeling of being stripped of humanity, reduced to tools of suffering. For many, labor was simply another path to death, stretched out over weeks instead of days. The barracks themselves offered no relief from this relentless cycle of torment. Wooden huts, hastily constructed and poorly maintained, were packed beyond capacity, with hundreds of prisoners squeezed into spaces meant for a fraction of that number. Straw mattresses, soiled and crawling with lice, were shared by multiple people at once, leaving no room to move. The air inside was thick with the stench of sweat, sickness and unwashed bodies, suffocating in both heat and cold. In winter, the huts froze with icy draughts cutting through every crack. In summer, they stifled with unbearable heat. Sanitation was non-existent, with overflowing latrines spreading filth and disease through every corner. Water was scarce, often muddy or contaminated, and bathing was a forgotten luxury. The barracks became breeding grounds for typhus, dysentery, and other deadly illnesses. Sleep was elusive, interrupted by the cries of the sick, the coughs of the dying, or the shrieks of guards barging in for surprise inspections. For prisoners, the barracks were not shelter, but another extension of their torment. They were places where life decayed slowly, stripped of dignity and comfort. The psychological torment accompanied the physical hardships, deepening the despair that marked every prisoner's existence. Constant hunger, exhaustion, and the ever-present threat of death created a state of mental numbness where hope itself seemed dangerous. Many prisoners withdrew into silence, conserving energy and willpower, their minds shrinking into survival mode. Families were torn apart as men and women were separated, children left to fend for themselves in unimaginable conditions. The knowledge that escape was impossible left prisoners trapped not only physically but emotionally. Rumors of outside events occasionally filtered in, but for most, the war beyond the barbed wire might as well have been another world. Guards deliberately sowed fear, spreading lies about loved ones, or mocking the prisoner's suffering. Even friendships, fragile lifelines of support, were strained under the weight of starvation and despair. Trust was difficult, when survival often meant competing for scraps of food or avoiding punishment. The camp became a place where the human spirit was attacked as ruthlessly as the body. In Bergen-Belsen, despair was not accidental, it was carefully engineered. Illness was a constant companion in Bergen-Belsen, where disease claimed as many lives as hunger or brutality. The lack of medicine, combined with unsanitary conditions, allowed epidemics to spread unchecked. Typhus raged through the camp, carried by lice, turning feverish bodies into corpses within days. Dysentery left prisoners dehydrated, too weak to stand, their suffering ignored by guards. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and scabies thrived among the emaciated prisoners whose immune systems could no longer resist. The so-called infirmaries offered no real treatment. Patients lay on filthy straw, unattended, until death relieved them of suffering. Doctors among the prisoners did what they could with no supplies, often forced to choose who might have a chance to live, and who was already lost. Many inmates feared the infirmary as a place of no return, preferring to suffer in the barracks rather than be abandoned to die alone. The sheer number of corpses overwhelmed the camp, piling up faster than they could be buried or burned. Illness in Bergen-Belsen was not merely a consequence of neglect, it was another weapon of mass destruction. Children, too, bore the weight of Bergen-Belsen's horrors, their short lives consumed by suffering. Many arrived already weakened by transport, clinging to parents who often perished within days. Infants wasted away quickly, their cries silenced by hunger and disease. Older children, robbed of education and play, learned instead to stand for hours at roll call or search desperately for scraps of food. Some became caretakers for younger siblings, taking on impossible responsibilities in a world devoid of mercy. Guards showed no compassion, often mocking or striking children as cruelly as they did adults. For many mothers, watching their children starve was the deepest form of agony, more unbearable than their own suffering. Families fractured under this relentless strain, with children often left orphaned amid strangers. In rare moments, prisoners tried to protect the innocence of children, telling stories or singing lullabies to shield them from the grim reality. Yet in Bergen-Belsen, Even childhood was stolen, replaced by a struggle that ended for most in silence and loss. Despite these overwhelming conditions, sparks of resilience flickered in the daily lives of the prisoners. Fragile yet remarkable, in whispered conversations, prisoners shared memories of home, clinging to fragments of identity that the camp sought to erase. Some found solace in prayer, reciting verses in hushed tones while guards prowled outside. Others risked punishment to smuggle food or aid to those weaker than themselves. Acts of kindness, sharing a crust of bread, offering a place on a straw mattress, or tending to the sick, became radical forms of resistance. These gestures, small but profound, reminded prisoners that humanity had not been completely extinguished. For many, such moments offered just enough strength to survive one more day. Even in despair, the will to live remained stubbornly present, defying the camp's machinery of death. Bergen-Belsen was designed to erase dignity, but dignity endured in these hidden acts of compassion. Each day of survival was itself a quiet rebellion against the forces of annihilation, and in that rebellion, hope, however faint, still lived. When Bergen-Belsen underwent its expansion in 1943, one of the most striking and deceptive divisions was the creation of the so-called Star Camp. This section, named for the yellow Star of David that Jewish prisoners were forced to wear, was not designed for extermination in the immediate sense, but rather for a cruel game of politics. The Nazis, particularly under Himmler's directives, sought to use Jewish lives as bargaining chips, imagining that they could trade them for German citizens abroad or for material resources. Families were told that their survival hinged on potential exchange agreements, giving them a faint and agonizing glimmer of hope. Unlike in Auschwitz or Treblinka, where the machinery of death worked at a rapid pace, Bergen-Belsen dangled survival as a conditional promise. Prisoners in this compound often arrived believing their stay would be temporary, an interlude before release to neutral countries. Yet this very illusion made their imprisonment more psychologically torturous. They were constantly reminded of freedom, yet denied it. Day by day, they lingered between hope and despair, never knowing whether negotiations would materialize. It was a camp of suspended lives, where every passing day blurred the line between expectation and betrayal. The origins of the Star Camp were rooted in the Nazis' strategy to exploit international connections and manipulate global opinion. Jewish prisoners selected for this camp often held foreign citizenship or ties to neutral nations such as Spain, Switzerland, Turkey, or South American countries. In the twisted logic of the SS, these individuals could serve as currency in diplomatic negotiations. From the outset, it was clear that this was not about mercy, but utility. Himmler, calculating to the end, imagined scenarios where Jewish lives might be exchanged for trucks, war supplies, or German prisoners held abroad. But these exchanges were rare, slow, and mostly illusory. The Nazis inflated hopes to maintain control and submission, knowing that the faint chance of release could keep desperate prisoners compliant. Many Jews believed they might eventually reach safety in Palestine or neutral Europe, but the vast majority never left Bergen-Belsen alive. The cruel facade of the Star Camp masked its true nature, a holding pen for bargaining that rarely delivered on its promises. Life inside the Star Camp, though superficially distinct from the extermination camps, was still marked by crushing deprivation. Prisoners were not sent directly to gas chambers, but their survival was chipped away by relentless hunger, overcrowding, and disease. Food rations were meager, barely enough to sustain life, consisting often of watery soup, crusts of bread or coffee substitute. Families clung to one another in cramped wooden barracks, where lice and fleas spread unchecked, carrying typhus and dysentery. The sense of suspended existence gnawed at them. They were not condemned outright, but they were never truly safe. Mothers tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy, whispering stories to children or sharing scraps of food, yet the environment was one of despair. Prisoners lived each day with the gnawing uncertainty that negotiations could collapse and that their tenuous status would vanish overnight. Even without crematoria chimneys rising above them, death haunted every corner of the Star Camp. The promise of exchange was frequently dangled in front of prisoners only to be cruelly withdrawn. Some did indeed leave Bergen-Belsen, transported under rare agreements to Switzerland or Palestine, but these were the exceptions that proved the rule. Most remained behind, clinging to rumors and whispers that circulated like wildfire through the barracks. A rumor of a transport list would ignite hope, only to end in bitter disappointment when names were missing or entire exchanges were cancelled. The psychological toll of this manipulation was devastating. Prisoners became trapped in cycles of expectation and despair, unable to grieve fully or prepare themselves mentally for death, because the possibility of release never completely disappeared. This deliberate cruelty was a hallmark of Nazi control, offering hope only to extinguish it, ensuring that suffering remained both physical and emotional. Survivors later spoke of how this form of torment was worse than the certainty of extermination, for it kept them in a perpetual state of agony. The Star Camp was also a showcase for deception, used by the Nazis to project an image of civility to the outside world in carefully orchestrated visits, such as those arranged for the Red Cross or neutral observers. The Nazis displayed this section as evidence of their supposed willingness to negotiate and treat prisoners with relative humanity. Selected areas were cleaned, prisoners were instructed to appear orderly, and certain details were deliberately staged. The illusion was powerful enough to mislead some visitors, at least temporarily, into believing that Jews were not uniformly condemned to death. Yet once the observers left, the grim reality resumed. Rations were cut again, treatment grew harsher, and the starvation continued. These staged presentations were not only a tool of propaganda, but also a cover for the ongoing extermination occurring elsewhere. The Star Camp served as a cruel mask, hiding the depths of Nazi brutality under a thin veil of diplomacy. Among the prisoners of the Star Camp were many individuals who had been prominent in their communities before the war: teachers, doctors, rabbis, and intellectuals who had once believed their foreign passports or connections might shield them from the worst. Families carried with them documents, letters, and proof of citizenship, clinging to the belief that these papers would save their lives. Children, wide-eyed and innocent, asked parents when they would be leaving for Palestine, when they would see their homes again. But as months turned into years, these dreams unraveled under the crushing weight of reality. Survivors later recalled how the barracks, filled with intellectual conversations and religious observances in the early months, slowly turned into places of silence and despair. Starvation hollowed out even the most hopeful spirits, and by the end, the camp was a place of skeletal figures waiting for death rather than exchange. The betrayal of the Star Camp prisoners was total, for even those who survived long enough to be included in negotiations often faced further disappointment. Families were separated, with men sometimes exchanged while women and children were left behind, or vice versa. Trains that departed for neutral countries were overcrowded, filthy, and perilous, and not all who boarded survived the journey. Worse still, as the war turned against Germany and desperation set in, Himmler sought increasingly far-fetched exchanges, such as proposals to trade Jewish lives for trucks, which the Allies refused. This meant that the majority of the Star Camp's population became expendable once their supposed value could not be leveraged. In the final months of the war, the conditions deteriorated so severely that the exchange promise became meaningless, and most prisoners perished from disease and neglect. In the history of Bergen-Belsen, The Star Camp stands as a chilling testament to the Nazi capacity for psychological manipulation and deception. It was not the swift death of gas chambers, but the prolonged torment of false hope that defined this compound. Families who entered believing in survival were slowly broken down by betrayal, starvation, and despair. Only a tiny fraction ever left under the exchange system, while the majority shared the fate of other Bergen-Belsen prisoners, disease, exhaustion, and death. The legacy of the Star Camp reminds us that cruelty does not always come in the form of overt violence. Sometimes it is the slow erosion of hope that destroys lives most completely. When liberation came in April 1945, the few survivors emerged as living witnesses to a policy that dangled freedom as a cruel mirage, a mirage that cost thousands their final strength. The Star Camp was not a refuge, it was another battlefield in the war of survival, where the weapon was hope itself. WW2. In the cold, barbed wire confines of Bergen-Belsen, the presence of children was both a haunting reminder of innocence and a reflection of the camp's merciless cruelty. They arrived clutching the hands of their mothers, carrying small satchels with trinkets of a life stolen from them. Many were deported from across Europe, Poland, the Netherlands, Hungary, and beyond, shipped like cattle in overcrowded trains, where hunger and fear were their first companions. The youngest, some barely able to walk, often cried through the night, their tears unnoticed by guards hardened to human suffering. Once inside, the children were stripped not only of their belongings, but of the very rhythms of childhood itself. Laughter, curiosity, and play, the lifeblood of youth, were replaced with silence, fatigue, and dread. Malnutrition gnawed at their small bodies with ruthless efficiency, stunting growth and dimming eyes once bright with life. Many mothers tried desperately to shield their children, rationing scraps of food or standing closer in line to shield them from beatings. Yet in Bergen-Belsen, childhood was not merely interrupted, it was destroyed, eroded slowly and painfully, until survival became the only language left. The daily struggle for nourishment weighed heavily on the children of Bergen-Belsen, whose frail frames bore witness to the camp's starvation policies. They often scavenged the ground for crumbs, gnawed on pieces of wood, or begged silently with wide, hollow eyes. Bread was a luxury, watery turnip soup, a rare lifeline, and clean water nearly unattainable. Infants wasted away in their mothers' arms, their cries fading into quiet resignation. Older children, attempting to bear adult burdens, offered their meager portions to younger siblings in desperate acts of familial devotion. Yet hunger was not only a physical torment, it was a psychological shackle, twisting their dreams into nightmares of food they could never taste. Every mealtime became a ritual of despair, a counting of stomach cramps against the clock of mortality. Guards watched impassively, sometimes mocking their desperation, reinforcing the camp's unrelenting cruelty. Starvation turned children into shadows of themselves, their innocence consumed alongside their strength. In Bergen-Belsen, even the simple act of eating or failing to eat became a matter of life, death, and dignity lost. Disease, unchecked and rampant, ravaged the children with merciless precision. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and scabies spread through their malnourished bodies like fire in a dry forest. The cramped and unsanitary barracks, reeking with filth and overcrowding, offered no refuge from contagion. Children coughed through nights of fever, while lice burrowed into their skin, leaving behind relentless itching and infection. The smallest of scratches, left untreated, often turned septic and deadly. Medical care, if available at all, was rudimentary and discriminatory, reserved mostly for those deemed useful. Families begged for medicine that never came, watching helplessly as tiny bodies convulsed or grew still under threadbare blankets. For children, illness was often a swift death sentence, their weakened bodies unable to fight. What should have been a common childhood ailment became a terminal condition within Bergen-Belsen's gates. In this world of deprivation, disease thrived, becoming as much a weapon as bullets and batons. The camp was not only a prison, it was a breeding ground for epidemics that cut down children in staggering numbers. Amidst the pervasive suffering, mothers and fathers tried to preserve fragments of normalcy for their children, though these efforts often unfolded in heartbreaking futility. A mother might whisper a lullaby under her breath, rocking her child in secret, her voice trembling with exhaustion. Some parents invented stories of faraway places, painting imaginary landscapes of forests, rivers and fields that their children might never see again. In the rare moments of relative calm, children improvised games with stones, scraps of wood, or even their own hands, clinging to fleeting sparks of imagination. Parents attempted to celebrate birthdays with invisible cakes, singing songs to remind their little ones that they were loved, despite the horrors that surrounded them. These small acts of defiance were testaments of resilience, brief attempts to hold on to humanity in a place designed to erase it. Yet even these fragile rituals were shadowed by despair, for the illusion of normalcy was always pierced by hunger, cold, and brutality. For many children, their parents' whispered assurances that things will get better became haunting promises never fulfilled. The camp's psychological toll was devastating for children who were too young to understand the mechanisms of war, but old enough to feel its relentless cruelty. Their world was reduced to fences, guards, and the constant fear of separation. Many watched siblings and parents collapse before their eyes, memories of family dissolving into trauma. Nightmares plagued their brief, restless sleep, filled with images of violence and loss. Some withdrew into silence, their spirits broken, staring blankly as though already resigned to fate. Others exhibited startling maturity, forced by necessity to become caretakers for younger siblings, or even for parents too weak to move. Childhood innocence, once a natural shield, became a casualty in Bergen-Belsen's cruelty. They learned early that hope was dangerous, that trust could be betrayed, and that survival required endurance beyond their years. In a world where compassion was a liability, these children aged decades in days, carrying invisible scars that no liberation could erase. Their psychological wounds lingered, even for the rare survivors who lived to tell their stories. Among the most tragic aspects of Bergen-Belsen's child prisoners was the cruel deception that occasionally offered false hope. Some children were placed in the star camp, where their lives were dangled as bargaining chips for potential prisoner exchanges. Families whispered about rumors of freedom, convincing themselves that release might be near. For a child, these whispers were intoxicating, sparking dreams of returning to school, playing in gardens, or tasting warm bread once more. But the vast majority of these promises ended in betrayal, as the exchange system faltered or was deliberately sabotaged. Instead of freedom, children remained in limbo, their hopes crushed under the weight of endless waiting. This cycle of expectation and disappointment carved deep psychological scars, teaching even the youngest that joy could be a dangerous illusion. In Bergen-Belsen, hope was as lethal as hunger, because its betrayal stripped away the final fragments of childhood trust. For many, the greatest cruelty was not only death itself, but the dying of dreams before death arrived. Stories of survival, though rare, reveal the extraordinary resilience of children, even in the darkest corners of Bergen-Belsen. Some clung fiercely to life, sustained by the strength of family bonds or the kindness of fellow prisoners. Secret acts of solidarity, a smuggled crust of bread, a sip of water shared by a stranger, sometimes made the difference between life and death. Children who survived did so not only through chance, but through the collective efforts of those who refused to abandon them. Testimonies from survivors recall how even the smallest gesture, such as a guard's momentary indifference or a nurse's stolen medicine, could extend a child's fragile existence. Yet survival often came at the cost of lifelong scars, with memories of skeletal bodies and silent barracks forever etched into their minds. These survivors became living witnesses to a chapter of history too harrowing for words, their childhoods buried beneath the ashes of Bergen-Belsen. Their stories remind us that survival was never simple victory, it was endurance, resilience, and tragedy entwined. The presence of children in Bergen-Belsen remains one of the camp's most haunting legacies, embodying the brutality of a system that robbed the youngest of humanity's most precious gift, innocence. Their small voices, silenced by hunger and disease, echo through survivor testimonies and historical records. Every lost child represents not just a life cut short, but generations of possibility erased, futures unfulfilled, and dreams destroyed. The sheer cruelty of forcing children into such conditions reveals the depth of the Nazi regime's inhumanity, where even the most vulnerable were not spared. Liberation in April 1945 revealed scenes so horrific that even hardened soldiers wept at the sight of lifeless children stacked in piles among the dead. These images, seared into history, underscore the catastrophic scale of suffering endured by the youngest victims. To remember Bergen-Belsen's children is to confront the darkest truths of human cruelty and the fragility of innocence. Their stories, though often silenced, endure as eternal reminders of the cost of hatred. In their lost innocence lies the heaviest indictment of the camp's legacy. In the suffocating confines of Bergen-Belsen, women bore burdens that were both unique and crushing, layered upon the already unimaginable suffering of life inside the camp. They arrived in transports packed so tightly that mothers clutched their children as if their very grasp could shield them from fate. Once through the gates, women were herded into barracks where filth, overcrowding, and stench became constant companions. Many had been uprooted violently from their homes, robbed of husbands, and left to shoulder survival alone. For those who arrived with families, the instinct to protect their children or siblings became a tormenting responsibility in a place designed to crush hope. Unlike men, women faced an additional dimension of exploitation. Their gender became another tool of humiliation and control. They were subjected to constant searches, strip interrogations, and degrading inspections by SS overseers who wielded power with cold cruelty. In this world stripped of dignity, femininity itself became a vulnerability. And yet, amidst these relentless trials, women exhibited a fierce resilience, carving out fleeting moments of humanity where none should have survived. Their story in Bergen-Belsen is a testimony to suffering, but also to endurance under the harshest conditions imaginable. Life inside the women's barracks was an endless ordeal of deprivation, disease, and despair. Bedding was absent, and straw mats were quickly infested with lice, adding to the spread of typhus and dysentery. Women slept side by side, often pressed against strangers, with no privacy or comfort. Hunger gnawed at their bodies, as daily rations of watery soup and stale bread were far too little to sustain life. Pregnant women and mothers nursing infants faced the cruelest torment, watching their children starve in their arms while powerless to provide. Sanitation facilities were woefully inadequate, leaving women humiliated as they queued for latrines that were little more than pits of disease. Periods, miscarriages, and childbirth unfolded without medical aid, causing additional agony and shame. Female prisoners often had to trade morsels of food or scraps of clothing for even a modicum of relief, For the SS guards, women's suffering was both a tool of control and a display of power, reinforcing the atmosphere of domination. Yet, amidst this relentless degradation, women attempted to support one another, forging fragile bonds of solidarity that helped them endure the crushing weight of daily life. Pregnancy inside Bergen-Belsen was a cruel paradox, new life struggling to emerge in a place built for death. Women who arrived already pregnant faced the grim reality that survival was almost impossible for both themselves and their infants. Many miscarried due to malnutrition, stress, or physical abuse, their bodies unable to sustain life in such conditions. Those who carried to term often gave birth in filth, with no midwives, no medical supplies, and no clean water. Infants were born into an environment where starvation and disease awaited them at once. Mothers were sometimes forced to smother their newborns themselves, a heart-wrenching act done to spare them prolonged suffering. Others attempted desperately to nourish their children with breast milk that had dried up from hunger. Guards treated pregnant women with disdain, often mocking them for their condition and providing no extra rations or care. Each new birth inside the camp underscored the cruelty of a system that had stripped away every vestige of humanity. Yet some mothers clung to the smallest fragments of hope, cradling their babies with whispered lullabies amidst the cries of the dying. These stories reflect the devastating collision of motherhood and survival in Bergen-Belsen. Children, though their plight is often spoken of separately, were intimately bound to the suffering of their mothers inside Bergen-Belsen. Women expended their own strength in an attempt to prolong their children's lives, often denying themselves scraps of bread or drops of soup so their young could eat. When children fell ill, mothers sacrificed sleep to tend them, cradling fevered bodies against their skeletal frames. Yet the harsh reality was that no amount of love could stop the spread of typhus, tuberculosis, or dysentery. The screams of a child's hunger were an unbearable torment, piercing through the barracks and shattering what little composure women could muster. The grief of mothers burying their children in shallow pits was a daily, agonizing reminder of the futility of hope. Still, women carried on, compelled by instinct, often trying to keep children occupied with whispered stories or fragments of songs remembered from life before. These moments of maternal care became small acts of rebellion against a system designed to extinguish their humanity. For women, their children were both the reason to fight for survival and the source of their deepest despair. In Bergen-Belsen, motherhood became both a burden and a fragile torch of resistance against despair. Beyond the horrors of starvation and disease, women in Bergen-Belsen endured targeted humiliation by their captors. SS guards and female overseers wielded their authority with calculated cruelty, singling out women for public beatings or degrading inspections. Some were forced to strip naked in front of others, a deliberate stripping of dignity meant to break their spirit. Women's long hair was often shaved, further erasing their sense of identity and individuality. Sexual violence, though less documented in Bergen-Belsen compared to other camps, remained a constant threat that hung over women's daily lives. The mere possibility of such exploitation instilled an ever-present fear, exacerbating their psychological torment. Guards often leveraged food or relative leniency in exchange for submission, creating impossible choices for desperate women. Female prisoners sometimes became the targets of jealousy or rivalry, as small privileges were manipulated to sow discord. The layers of shame imposed by the regime deepened the isolation of many women, compounding their suffering. Yet, even in the face of such degradation, women clung to their humanity, refusing to let the system fully erase their dignity. Their survival in these conditions was not only physical, but deeply psychological. Acts of solidarity among women inside Bergen-Belsen provided rare but essential lifelines. They shared food in secret, passing crumbs or sips of soup to those who were weakest. Older women often comforted younger ones, offering wisdom or encouragement when despair threatened to overwhelm them. In some barracks, women created makeshift families, protecting one another against the predations of guards and the cruelty of camp life. Whispered prayers, lullabies, and quiet songs became shared rituals that reminded them of the world beyond the barbed wire. Some women risked punishment to smuggle small scraps of clothing or blankets, helping others fend off the bitter cold. In a place where survival demanded ruthless self-preservation, these moments of compassion stood as extraordinary defiance. Women sustained each other not only through material aid, but through the preservation of memory, telling stories of home, loved ones, and life before the camp. These narratives reinforced identity in a system built to erase it. By helping one another endure, women cultivated resilience that multiplied their chances of survival. In the darkest corners of Bergen-Belsen, it was this solidarity that illuminated small sparks of humanity. The psychological toll of Bergen-Belsen weighed especially heavily on women, who carried both their own suffering and the suffering of those dependent on them. Many were haunted by the constant fear of losing children, siblings, or friends to disease and hunger. Others bore the guilt of surviving when their loved ones perished, a burden that lingered long after liberation. Depression, despair, and breakdowns were common. Yet women often suppressed their grief to keep moving forward. Survival required not only enduring physical torment, but maintaining some thread of mental endurance. Women clung to fragments of identity, remembering themselves as mothers, daughters, sisters, or professionals in lives before the camp. In this way, memory became a lifeline, preserving a sense of self that the Nazis sought to obliterate. Yet the trauma etched itself deeply into every survivor, shaping lives far beyond the barbed wire. After liberation, many women carried scars of shame, loss, and grief that words could scarcely convey. Their testimony reveals the depth of psychological devastation that Bergen-Belsen inflicted on its female prisoners. It was survival, but at a cost that remained long after freedom was restored. The story of women in Bergen-Belsen is one of unimaginable cruelty, but also of enduring strength. They endured degradation that stripped them of dignity, yet many found ways to resist by preserving fragments of compassion and identity. They suffered in ways that were gender-specific: pregnancy, motherhood, menstruation, and sexual vulnerability, becoming further layers of torment within an already brutal system. And yet, women often became the quiet backbone of survival, fostering solidarity in places where despair should have reigned supreme. Their stories remind us that survival was not just physical, but deeply tied to acts of emotional resilience and communal care. Bergen-Belsen was designed to erase individuality, to turn human beings into faceless statistics, but the women inside fought back in the most human ways possible. They whispered stories, shared crumbs of food, held one another when grief became unbearable, and cradled children against the cold. Each of these acts, however small, was an act of defiance against a machine of destruction. Today, their voices echo across history, demanding that we remember not only their suffering but their endurance. In honoring them, we recognize that even in the depths of despair, the human spirit, especially as embodied by the women of Bergen-Belsen, refused to be extinguished. Disease became the silent executioner within the barbed wire of Bergen-Belsen, claiming lives with a ruthless efficiency that surpassed even the brutality of guards and hunger. The overcrowding of the barracks, where hundreds were forced to share space designed for a fraction of that number, created the perfect breeding ground for epidemics. The winter dampness seeped into wooden walls, never allowing them to dry, so that every breath carried the moisture of rot and decay. Prisoners coughed in the darkness, their weak lungs unable to resist the contagion spreading rapidly through the air. The stench of unwashed bodies mixed with human waste, an environment where parasites thrived unchallenged. Lice crawled across sleeping mats, their infestation so widespread that resistance was futile. Each louse carried with it the threat of typhus, a disease that turned weakness into death in a matter of days. Dysentery followed close behind, transmitted through contaminated water and food handled in unsanitary conditions. Men, women, and children collapsed from dehydration, their bodies consumed by fever and diarrhea. In this environment, disease was no accident. It was the inevitable consequence of deliberate neglect. The outbreak of typhus struck Bergen-Belsen like a plague of biblical proportions, overwhelming the camp with a tide of death that could not be stopped. Typhus, carried by lice, spread explosively among prisoners whose immune systems were already shattered by malnutrition. It began with fevers and headaches, quickly escalating into delirium, hallucinations, and organ failure. Victims often lay motionless in their bunks, unable to move or respond, waiting for the end that came swiftly. Those still able to stand were forced to share space with the dying, their close quarters ensuring that every cough, every drop of sweat, passed the infection on. In some huts, dozens perished overnight, their bodies lying side by side with the still living, who no longer had the strength to protest. The guards rarely intervened, leaving corpses to remain among the sick until others removed them. Medical help was virtually non-existent. The camp infirmary was a place of despair, lacking medicine, supplies, or competent care. Instead of treatment, the prisoners were left to their fate, watching death spread as relentlessly as fire in dry grass. Typhus became synonymous with Bergen-Belsen, the disease that defined its horror. Dysentery ravaged the camp with equal cruelty, turning every sip of water and every morsel of food into a potential death sentence. The camp's sanitation facilities were grossly inadequate for the tens of thousands of prisoners forced to use them. Latrines overflowed, spilling filth into pathways where barefooted inmates stepped daily. The stench was overpowering, clinging to the air, seeping into clothes, and contaminating the only sources of drinking water. Prisoners grew skeletal, unable to retain nutrients as their bodies rejected what little food they received. Dysentery left its victims doubled over in pain, writhing in fever, their bodies rapidly weakening. Children and the elderly succumbed most quickly, their fragile bodies unable to withstand the rapid dehydration. Even strong adults collapsed, unable to stand after days of relentless illness. Guards and administrators ignored the conditions, indifferent to the suffering that their neglect caused. For the inmates, every trip to the latrine could be the beginning of an illness that would strip them of dignity, hope, and finally life itself. The conditions of the camp's barracks made recovery from illness nearly impossible, ensuring that Bergen-Belsen remained a place of perpetual epidemics. Straw mattresses, rarely changed and soaked in sweat and waste, became hotbeds for lice infestations. Prisoners lacked soap, and were often denied access to water for washing, allowing filth to accumulate on skin and clothing. In the freezing winters, water froze, leaving inmates with no means to clean themselves even if permitted. The huts had no ventilation, the air heavy with the breath of hundreds crammed together in suffocating darkness. Every cough echoed against the wooden walls, a reminder that disease was always near. Attempts to create makeshift remedies with herbs or improvised poultices brought little relief. Prisoners were too weak to care for one another, and the healthy quickly became the sick. There were no separations for the ill. The dying were left among the living until they expired. Thus, every barrack became both a hospital and a morgue, a place where hope expired alongside breath. Bergen-Belsen itself became an organism of disease, feeding on those trapped within its boundaries. Malnutrition amplified the effects of every illness, ensuring that even the simplest cold could spiral into death. Prisoners were fed a diet so inadequate that their bodies withered, leaving them unable to resist infection. Bread rations were stale and minimal, soups were watery and lacked nutrients, and meat was virtually non-existent. The human body requires strength to fight disease, but here strength was systematically stripped away. Children's bellies swelled with starvation, while adults' ribs pressed visibly against skin. Once fever struck, starvation accelerated the decline, hastening the collapse of vital organs. Prisoners became too weak to walk, dragging themselves across floors smeared with dirt and waste. Each day, new faces joined the ranks of the dying, their cries fading into silence. Disease and hunger formed a vicious cycle, feeding one another until escape was impossible. Bergen-Belsen became a graveyard long before liberation, with starvation and sickness its twin executioners. The scale of death overwhelmed the camp to the point of collapse, making Bergen-Belsen infamous as a place of uncontainable suffering. Corpses began to pile up in the barracks, sometimes lying for days next to the living before being removed. Prisoners too weak to carry them dragged bodies by arms or legs to mass graves, dug hurriedly by fellow inmates. In the spring of 1945, as the camp population swelled with transfers from other camps, the number of deaths spiraled beyond control. Records show that thousands died in a single month, their bodies stacked like firewood awaiting burial. Guards made little effort to hide the horror. Corpses lay in open fields, exposed to weather, scavenging animals and flies. The stench of death filled the camp, mingling with the odors of sickness and decay. Survivors lived in constant proximity to death, stepping over corpses on their way to roll call. Death became routine, no longer shocking, but simply the expected end to life in Bergen-Belsen. In this way, disease did not just kill bodies, it eroded the very meaning of existence. The epidemic spread so widely that even the SS guards and personnel feared for their safety, though their privileges shielded them from the worst. Some guards refused to enter barracks, preferring to bark orders from outside, terrified of catching typhus. Medical staff for the SS had access to disinfectants, protective clothing, and treatments, luxuries denied to prisoners. This separation highlighted the cruel double standard. The perpetrators shielded themselves while condemning their captives to death. Attempts were made in the final months to burn clothing and delouse barracks, but these efforts were too late and too half-hearted. The disease had already consumed the camp, thriving on the weakness of tens of thousands. Even so, the SS remained indifferent to the suffering, treating it as an inconvenience rather than a catastrophe of human lives. Prisoners who collapsed were often beaten for failing to move quickly enough, further reducing their chance of survival. The gulf between the treatment of guards and prisoners deepened the sense of injustice that defined the camp. Disease in Bergen-Belsen was not a natural disaster, it was a crime of deliberate neglect. By the time British forces liberated Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, the camp had become synonymous with disease, death, and unimaginable suffering. Soldiers entering the camp found 60,000 prisoners, most emaciated and many dying, alongside more than 10,000 unburied corpses. The liberators were confronted with typhus epidemics so severe that even their medical units struggled to contain them. Emergency hospitals were set up, but thousands more died in the weeks after liberation, despite all efforts. The British were forced to burn down barracks, recognizing that the structures themselves were saturated with disease. Survivors describe liberation as both salvation and tragedy, for freedom came too late for so many. The name Bergen-Belsen entered history not as a site of gas chambers, but as a place where disease and neglect accomplished the work of extermination. Its legacy became a warning of what happens when human beings are left to perish in engineered misery. The epidemics at Bergen-Belsen stand as a testimony to suffering inflicted not only by violence, but by the calculated denial of basic human needs. In the silence of its fields, disease still echoes as one of the camp's most haunting voices. In the winter of 1944, as the war reached its brutal crescendo, Anne Frank and her sister Margot were transported from Auschwitz to Bergen-Belsen. The journey itself was one of suffocating darkness, with hundreds of prisoners crammed into sealed cattle cars, the air thick with desperation, and the sound of muffled sobbing. When the doors finally creaked open, the sisters stumbled into the mud of Bergen-Belsen, greeted not by freedom, but by a horizon filled with barbed wire and the stench of decay. They were stripped of whatever remnants of dignity they had managed to preserve, folded into the endless mass of starving prisoners. The transition from Auschwitz to Belsen was not a reprieve, but merely an exchange of horrors, with starvation replacing the gas chambers as the primary executioner. To Anne, who once dreamed of freedom, the camp was a place of collapsing humanity, where survival depended not on hope, but on endurance. Her diary, which had given the world her voice, was already lost to her. Here she became just another nameless number in the endless machinery of Nazi cruelty. The cold wind cut through her thin striped uniform, a chilling reminder that even the elements were now her enemies. Bergen-Belsen, though not equipped with gas chambers, would prove every bit as deadly. For Anne and Margot, this was the final station in their young and fragile lives. Dysentery. The sisters were placed in the women's camp, where overcrowding had reached a breaking point. Over 30,000 women were crammed into wooden barracks designed for a fraction of that number, forcing them to sleep pressed tightly against strangers, unable to move freely even at night. The air inside was thick with disease, carrying the feverish coughs of the infected and the cries of the dying. For Anne and Margot, adjusting to this suffocating environment was impossible, for both were weakened by the conditions they had endured in Auschwitz. Rations consisted of watery soup and crusts of bread too stale to chew, leaving the sisters in a state of permanent hunger that gnawed at their already frail bodies. Anne, once so animated and full of words, grew quieter, her energy drained by the relentless demands of survival. Lice infested her clothes and hair, biting at her skin until she scratched herself raw. The sisters tried to lean on each other for strength, whispering faint words of comfort in the night, but the harsh reality made even comfort feel hollow. The women's camp was a place where love and loyalty struggled to exist against the grinding weight of disease and despair. Anne's presence there, though invisible at the time, would one day become a symbol for millions who never knew her face, but would come to know her voice. By early 1945, conditions in Bergen-Belsen deteriorated beyond comprehension. Allied advances had cut off supply lines, leaving prisoners to starve in heaps of skeletal suffering. Anne and Margot, like thousands of others, grew thinner each day, their cheeks hollowing until their eyes seemed to sink into their skulls. Typhus swept through the camp in waves, spreading through lice and unwashed bodies, infecting nearly everyone. The sisters were not spared. Anne developed a fever that left her shivering in the damp barracks, her hair tangled and falling out in clumps from malnutrition and disease. Margot too succumbed to weakness, collapsing from exhaustion one night and unable to rise again. The once vivid girl who had written about dreams of becoming a writer now drifted in and out of delirium, no longer able to summon words or cling to the hope she once cherished. The camp consumed every ounce of strength the sisters had, stripping away even their ability to comfort one another. The stench of death filled the air, and each day they awoke to find more lifeless bodies around them. For Anne, whose imagination had once soared beyond the attic walls in Amsterdam, Bergen-Belsen was the crushing end of all possibility. Margot was the first of the two sisters to collapse entirely. Eyewitnesses later recalled that she fell from her bunk, too weak to rise again, her body ravaged by typhus and starvation. Anne, already feverish and delirious herself, could only watch helplessly as her older sister faded. Their bond, forged through years of hiding and shared suffering, was severed by the relentless grip of disease. Days later, Anne too succumbed to the same fate, her youthful voice silenced forever in the spring of 1945, just weeks before the camp's liberation. Her death was not marked by ceremony or remembrance. Her body was thrown into a mass grave, indistinguishable from thousands of others. The enormity of her tragedy lies not only in her own lost potential, but in the fact that her fate mirrored that of so many children, sisters and daughters whose names history would never know. Yet in Anne's case, her diary would ensure that her story did not vanish into silence. Her words, written in the secrecy of an Amsterdam attic, would one day transcend the barbed wire of Bergen-Belsen to echo across the world. The story of Anne Frank in Bergen-Belsen is perhaps the most symbolic intersection of innocence and atrocity. Here was a young girl whose greatest crime was being born Jewish, yet her life was extinguished alongside tens of thousands of others in a camp of disease and neglect. What makes Anne's tragedy stand apart is the contrast between her earlier words, filled with resilience and optimism, and the cruel silence of her final days. She had once written, "In spite of everything, I still believe that people are really good at heart." That belief, tender and hopeful, now stood in stark contrast to the brutality of Bergen-Belsen, where cruelty and indifference ruled. The diary's survival, safeguarded by meek Guys in Amsterdam, meant that Anne's voice would ultimately outlive the silence of the camp. The world would come to see her not as a number, but as a person, a teenager whose dreams, fears, and reflections illuminated the human cost of the Holocaust. Bergen-Belsen consumed her body, but her spirit would survive in her words, ensuring she became a universal symbol of both tragedy and hope. Eyewitness accounts of Anne in Bergen-Belsen paint a haunting picture. Fellow prisoners remembered a frail, subdued girl, far removed from the spirited child who once filled her diary with playful wit and sharp observation. She was no longer the narrator of her own story, but had been reduced to a silent sufferer in a landscape of horror. Some described her trying to shield Margot, even in her weakened state, clinging to the fragments of sisterly devotion. Others recalled her quiet resignation, her eyes dulled by hunger and fever, yet still retaining flashes of gentleness. These memories, sparse though they are, ensure that Anne's final weeks are not wholly lost to oblivion. They reveal the human being behind the global symbol, a teenager who fought to survive against impossible odds, who suffered like countless others, and whose loss still resonates as one of history's most poignant tragedies. In this way, Bergen-Belsen became the place where Anne Frank, the girl, was lost, but Anne Frank, the voice of millions, was born. Mississippi? Anne's fate highlights the cruel irony of timing. Liberation came to Bergen-Belsen in April 1945, only weeks after her death. Had she survived just a little longer, she might have lived to see freedom, to reclaim her diary, to tell her own story. This nearness of salvation makes her loss all the more unbearable, a bitter reminder of how thin the line between survival and death was in the camps. For her father, Otto Frank, who survived Auschwitz and later learned of his daughter's deaths. The grief was indescribable. He alone remained, the sole custodian of Anne's words and dreams. In sharing her diary with the world, Otto ensured that Anne's voice would carry where her body could not. The diary became both a testimony and a warning, proof of what was lost, and a reminder of what humanity must never allow again. Bergen-Belsen, in this light, was not only the site of her death, but also the crucible in which her legacy was forged. Today, Anne Frank's connection to Bergen-Belsen serves as a solemn reminder of the countless unnamed victims who perished there. Her story gives a human face to the statistics of death, reminding the world that each number once belonged to a person with dreams, fears, and a family. The fields where she suffered are now preserved as a memorial, silent and still, bearing witness to the enormity of the crime committed there. Visitors walk among the mass graves, reflecting on the cruel fate of a girl whose diary continues to inspire millions. In every whispered word from her pages, Anne breathes life into the silence left behind by Bergen-Belsen. Her death there is not just a tragedy of one girl, but a symbol of the stolen futures of millions. And so, in telling her story, we honor not only Anne Frank, but all who were silenced by the barbed wire, hunger, and disease of Bergen-Belsen. When one steps into the narrative of Bergen-Belsen, it becomes impossible to separate the suffering of the prisoners from the faces of those who enforced it. The SS staff, who commanded and patrolled the camp, were not faceless bureaucrats, but individuals who carried out the Nazi system with ruthless efficiency. The camp commandants and guards were feared not only for their authority, but also for the cruelty they displayed daily. Among the names that haunt history, Joseph Kramer, later known as the Beast of Belsen, stands as a central figure in the camp's infamy. Under his command, Bergen-Belsen transitioned from a detention site into a place of unimaginable horror. Kramer's presence radiated both a chilling calm and a relentless brutality, a combination that terrified inmates who never knew when or why he might strike. Surrounding him was a cadre of guards, many of them young, indoctrinated, and often seeking to prove their loyalty through sadistic acts. For the prisoners, these figures became the embodiment of terror, walking reminders that mercy was absent from this world. Each guard's face, uniform and tone of voice left scars on memory, as indelible as the barbed wire that enclosed them. The atmosphere of Bergen-Belsen was shaped not only by hunger and disease, but by the ever-watchful eyes of its staff, whose choices determined life, death, or suffering without end. Josef Kramer, who assumed command of Bergen-Belsen in December 1944, had already made his name within the machinery of genocide. Before his transfer, he had served in Auschwitz, where his role in the selection process marked him as a figure of calculated brutality. His arrival at Bergen-Belsen brought with it the expertise of a man hardened by the mechanics of extermination. Kramer was known for his stern demeanor, his clipped orders, and the unnerving lack of hesitation in his punishments. Prisoners whispered his name with dread, for they knew that beneath his outward composure lay a capacity for unrestrained cruelty. He did not oversee the camp as a detached administrator. He embodied its harshest features, ensuring discipline through fear. Kramer's command coincided with the camp's deadliest months, when overcrowding, starvation, and disease claimed lives by the thousands each week. Survivors recalled seeing him walking calmly through scenes of chaos, indifferent to the corpses that piled around him. His indifference was not passive but active, a refusal to intervene in suffering that he saw as the prisoner's inevitable fate. Bergen-Belsen under Kramer became a reflection of his personality, cold, pitiless, and relentlessly destructive. Yet Joseph Kramer was not alone in shaping the atmosphere of terror within Bergen-Belsen. Surrounding him were dozens of SS guards, among them notorious figures like Irma Grayes. Grayes, who had previously served at Ravensbrück and Auschwitz, arrived at Bergen-Belsen as a young woman in her early 20s. Despite her youth, she quickly gained a reputation for sadism that rivaled or surpassed that of her male counterparts. Known by prisoners as the hyena of Auschwitz, her presence at Bergen-Belsen intensified the suffering of women prisoners in particular. Survivors recalled her whip, her boots, and her pleasure in enforcing punishments. Grayes' cruelty was not random but deliberate, carried out with the precision of someone who enjoyed her power. She was part of a broader cadre of female overseers who played a critical role in the daily enforcement of camp life, shattering the notion that brutality was confined to men. Prisoners saw in her the terrifying truth that cruelty could wear a youthful face and be delivered with a smile. Her actions etched her into the memory of survivors, a symbol of how indoctrination and opportunity could twist human nature into monstrosity. Beyond the infamous names, the staff of Bergen-Belsen was a collection of individuals who embodied the structure of Nazi control. Guards were drawn from the SS, trained in a system that emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and ideological loyalty above all else. Many were not long-serving veterans, but young recruits eager to demonstrate their commitment to the Reich. These individuals enforced discipline with beatings, humiliation, and arbitrary cruelty, turning the camp into a theater of constant fear. They patrolled the barracks, conducted roll calls that could last for hours, and often punished groups collectively for the perceived faults of one prisoner. The culture among the staff reinforced cruelty, rewarding displays of harshness and discouraging any sign of compassion. For inmates, even a glance or hesitation could result in violence, and guards wielded this authority with relish. The staff worked not merely as enforcers, but as agents of psychological domination, reminding prisoners that their lives were utterly disposable. This environment transformed Bergen-Belsen into more than a prison. It became a laboratory of dehumanization. The guards were not only participants but active architects of the suffering. The daily routine of the guards revealed a disturbing contrast between their lives and those of the prisoners. While inmates starved on watery soup and scraps of bread, the guards had access to rations, warmth, and relative comfort. This gulf reinforced the hierarchy of power, reminding prisoners that even their suffering was overseen by those who remained untouched by hunger and disease. Guards often carried themselves with arrogance, their uniforms immaculate against the backdrop of filth and despair. For them, life within Bergen-Belsen was not a burden but a posting that offered authority and a sense of belonging to the Nazi cause. Many were indifferent to the piles of corpses that grew each day, passing them without acknowledgement, as though they were nothing more than refuse. In this way, the staff's routines revealed not only cruelty, but a normalization of death. To survive in their roles, many guards had to see prisoners not as humans, but as expendable bodies. This dehumanization was both the cause and consequence of their actions, feeding into the endless cycle of neglect and brutality. The camp staff's very presence reinforced the prisoners' despair, as hope could not flourish under eyes that refused to see them as people. The power of the camp staff extended beyond physical control into the realm of psychological warfare. Prisoners lived under the constant awareness that guards held the authority to decide their fate in an instant. A misplaced word, a stumble during roll call, or even an expression of fatigue could provoke a beating or worse. This unpredictability eroded the spirit of inmates, who learned to fear not only hunger and disease, but the whims of those in power. The guards cultivated this fear deliberately, using it to enforce compliance and break resistance. Their shouts, whistles, and boots on the ground became sounds that etched themselves into memory long after liberation. For many survivors, the lasting trauma was not only the starvation or disease, but the psychological scars of living under such absolute domination. Even small acts of kindness, rare and often fleeting, were overshadowed by the overwhelming cruelty of the system. The guards' presence ensured that the camp was not only a site of physical suffering, but a prison of the mind. Bergen-Belsen became a place where fear itself was weaponized, and the staff were its chosen instruments. Accountability for the camp staff came only after the war, when the horrors of Bergen-Belsen were exposed to the world. The liberation of the camp in April 1945 revealed not only the suffering of the prisoners, but also the faces of those who had presided over it. Joseph Kramer, Irma Grace, and others were captured, placed on trial, and confronted with the testimonies of survivors. The Belsen trials, held by British authorities, became one of the earliest attempts to bring justice for crimes against humanity. Witness after witness recounted the acts of brutality, naming the guards who had tormented them. Kramer defended himself by claiming obedience to orders, but the court saw through the defense of blind loyalty. Grace's youth did not shield her, as testimonies painted her as one of the most feared figures in the camp. The trials ended with death sentences for many, including Kramer and Grace, whose executions served as a grim measure of justice. Yet justice could not erase the suffering they had caused, nor the lives lost under their authority. The story of Bergen-Belsen's staff lingers as a reminder of how ordinary individuals can become instruments of extraordinary evil. Joseph Kramer and Irma Gracie remain infamous, but they were part of a larger system that encouraged and rewarded brutality. Their actions were not isolated acts of cruelty, but reflections of an ideology that stripped people of their humanity. In remembering the staff of Bergen-Belsen, history forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, obedience, and the capacity for human beings to inflict suffering. Their legacies endure not only in court records and survivor testimonies, but in the lessons they leave behind. They stand as warnings of what happens when ideology erases compassion and authority replaces conscience. In the story of Bergen-Belsen, the guards and commanders are not mere figures of the past. They are symbols of the dangers that persist whenever humanity is devalued. To tell their story is to hold up a mirror to the darkest potential of human nature. And in doing so, we commit ourselves to remembering so that such cruelty is never allowed to reign again. In a place where every effort was made to silence individuality, the act of recording one's thoughts became an act of resistance. Prisoners at Bergen-Belsen who kept diaries or later shared their testimonies offered the world a direct window into their pain, courage, and longing for dignity. Each entry or recollection was not merely a story, it was proof that humanity persisted in a landscape designed to erase it. These voices carried fragments of daily life, the exhaustion of standing through hours-long roll calls, the terror of epidemics sweeping through the barracks, the torment of hunger that consumed both body and spirit. But beyond descriptions of suffering, they also carried small flickers of hope, memories of home, or dreams of freedom. The very existence of these writings shows the resilience of human memory against unimaginable forces of obliteration. Survivors would later speak of smuggled scraps of paper, hidden in seams of clothing, written by trembling hands during stolen moments of solitude. Their words often risked discovery, and discovery meant death. Yet they wrote anyway. For them, it was not only testimony for the world, but also a cry to affirm their existence in a place where names were replaced by numbers. One testimony recalls the devastating hunger that dominated every waking thought, A survivor described how each morning began with watery coffee and a scrap of bread so small it barely covered a palm, followed by thin soup at noon that offered little more than colored water. The diary explained how hunger altered perceptions, the mind focused obsessively on food, and even the faintest smell could torment or spark arguments among starving inmates. People dreamed of warm kitchens, plates filled with steaming potatoes, or the sweetness of a fruit they had once taken for granted. Hunger not only ate away at their bodies, but fractured their sense of self, reducing them to creatures of raw survival instinct. Yet these same testimonies also show how the sharing of even a crumb could become a profound gesture of solidarity. Some wrote of mothers denying themselves to give the last bite to a child, or strangers offering what little they had to someone weaker. These stories remind us that even in a world orchestrated by cruelty, compassion survived in fragile, astonishing moments. The voices of children echo hauntingly through testimonies preserved after the war. One diary, written by a teenage girl before she perished, spoke not of politics or ideology, but of simple dreams, wanting to walk barefoot on grass again, longing to hug her grandmother, craving the sound of laughter, untainted by fear. Testimonies tell us how children tried to turn survival into games, counting lice in each other's hair, or imagining contests to distract themselves from hunger pangs. Yet the silence in these writings is equally telling. Many stop abruptly, their voices cut short by death before the diary could be finished. Survivors later recounted that the laughter of children, once a source of hope, became an unbearable reminder of innocence being extinguished. The weight of those truncated voices presses on us even today, revealing the scale of life stolen, not just in numbers, but in the loss of potential, of futures never lived. These testimonies, whether written or spoken later, force us to confront not just statistics, but shattered childhoods. Women's testimonies reveal dimensions of the camp experience that were uniquely shaped by gender. Some wrote of their struggle to protect their children in an environment where protection was nearly impossible. Others described the humiliations of public searches, the stripping away of modesty, and the cruel exploitation they endured at the hands of guards. Yet they also chronicled moments of quiet defiance. Mothers braiding their daughters' hair with makeshift combs, women singing lullabies in whispers after lights out, or sharing knowledge of herbal remedies when medicine was absent. A survivor's testimony spoke of a clandestine act of resistance, women teaching each other poems or reciting lines from memory to preserve culture in a place designed to erase it. These testimonies underline that survival was not only physical, but also spiritual, sustained by fragments of identity that women fought to hold on to. Their words remind us that even amidst systemic degradation, they carved out islands of dignity, however fleeting. Diaries and testimonies also capture the psychological torment prisoners faced as they oscillated between despair and hope. Some survivors described how days blurred into endless monotony, with no sense of time except for the ringing of the camp bell. Hope arrived in the form of rumors, whispers that the Allies were advancing, that liberation might be near. Testimonies described the agony of believing, only to see weeks stretch into months of continued suffering. Others confessed the guilt of surviving when so many around them perished, a burden that followed them for the rest of their lives. One diary spoke of counting each day survived as a victory, but also as a reminder of lives lost. The voices do not conceal their exhaustion, nor do they mask the collapse of faith many felt. Yet within these testimonies, there is also a strange persistence of hope, a belief, even if faint, that life beyond the fences was still possible. Some prisoner writings recorded not only suffering, but also an acute awareness of history unfolding around them. They knew they were witnesses to a crime of unimaginable scale, and many wrote specifically for posterity. Testimonies reveal prisoners writing lines like, "If no one survives, let these words tell what was done here." Their words were not written for themselves alone, but for generations yet unborn. This awareness transformed each diary into both a personal document and a historical artifact, a fragment of truth that survived attempts at erasure. Survivors later shared that they carried an almost sacred duty to speak, to tell the world not only what happened, but also how it felt to endure it. Diaries, scraps of poetry, and whispered stories thus became weapons against forgetting. Their words live on, offering us direct access to the raw texture of life in Bergen-Belsen, a truth untouched by official reports or statistics. The aftermath of the camp did not silence these voices, but instead amplified them. After liberation, many survivors gave testimonies to Allied forces, recounting horrors with painful detail. These accounts were often filled with trembling pauses, tears, and moments when language seemed inadequate to capture what they had endured. Survivors spoke of the stench of corpses piled outside barracks, of the cries of the dying left unattended, of the faces of those who would never leave. These testimonies formed the backbone of post-war trials, ensuring that the perpetrators could not hide behind denial. Yet they also served another purpose, to reclaim humanity by telling the world, "We lived, we suffered, we remember." Each testimony spoken aloud was an act of reclaiming the narrative from those who had sought to silence it. Today, the voices of Bergen-Belsen's prisoners continue to resonate through published memoirs, recordings, and museum archives. They remind us not only of the depth of human suffering, but also of the remarkable persistence of memory. Every diary entry, every testimony recorded, ensures that the names of the dead are not reduced to mere numbers. They stand as an eternal warning against the dangers of indifference, and as a tribute to resilience under oppression. The voices are often difficult to hear, filled with anguish that still pierces across decades, but that difficulty is their power. They do not allow us the comfort of distance. They demand that we listen. Through them, we understand that Bergen-Belsen was not just a place of death, but a place where, against all odds, humanity found ways to speak. And in their words, the dead live on, testifying not only to what was lost, but also to what must never be forgotten. By early 1945, the Nazi regime was crumbling under the relentless advance of the Allied armies, and yet the machinery of the concentration camps continued to operate with brutal intensity. As the Soviet forces swept across Poland and the Eastern territories, camps such as Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and Stutthof were hastily evacuated. Tens of thousands of prisoners, skeletal and near death, were forced on death marches through the bitter winter, their frozen footsteps leaving trails of bodies along the roads. Bergen-Belsen, once intended as a relatively minor holding site, suddenly became the dumping ground for these endless human transports. The camp, already struggling with inadequate resources, was thrust into chaos as transports arrived one after another. Trains pulled into its perimeter, carrying hundreds crammed into boxcars, many of them dead before the doors were pried open. The surviving arrivals staggered into a camp, already bursting beyond its capacity, with no beds, no food, and no medical supplies awaiting them. Instead of refuge, they found a festering hell, where overcrowding suffocated the last threads of order. What followed was a descent into conditions so catastrophic that even hardened survivors described it as the collapse of civilization within barbed wire. The camp, originally built to hold a few thousand prisoners, now swelled uncontrollably, its population surging to nearly 60,000 in the span of weeks. Wooden barracks meant to shelter 100 now confined 800 or more, with men, women, and children lying on bare floors in layers of human bodies. The stench of unwashed flesh and excrement hung thick in the air, saturating every corner. Prisoners were packed so tightly that turning in one's sleep was almost impossible, and air itself seemed to vanish in the suffocating press of humanity. New arrivals, too weak to resist, collapsed at the threshold of overcrowded huts, only to be dragged inside and laid upon already dying prisoners. Starvation gnawed at every body, with food rations shrinking to almost nothing as the camp's infrastructure buckled. The SS showed no interest in solving the chaos. Instead, they allowed despair to deepen as if watching an experiment in human breakdown. For many, the overcrowding became as lethal as bullets or beatings, slowly suffocating prisoners in a living grave of flesh. The chaos was further amplified by the deliberate neglect of camp leadership, who did nothing to prepare for the influx. Water supplies that had once been marginally functional now broke down under the strain of so many bodies. Prisoners queued for hours, only to sip filthy water contaminated with disease. Latrines overflowed and human waste spilled into pathways and seeped into the floors of the barracks. Vermin thrived in this environment, with lice, fleas, and rats weaving freely through the camp, spreading infection faster than any medicine could hope to stop. Hunger reduced many to scavenging through refuse or clawing at the earth for scraps of rotting potato peels. Mothers, desperate to feed their children, tore into garbage heaps while their infants wasted away in their arms. Every moment of daily existence was defined by the collision of too many bodies and too little of everything else: food, water, medicine, and dignity. The camp, in effect, was drowning in its own collapse. This is, among those deported to Bergen-Belsen in 1945 were survivors of Auschwitz, Gross-Rosen, and Ravensbrück, many already on the brink of death from earlier ordeals. They carried with them diseases incubated in overcrowded boxcars and freezing death marches. Within days of arriving, epidemics spread like fire through tinder. Typhus raged most fiercely, its telltale fever and delirium claiming thousands each week. Dysentery tore through weakened stomachs, leaving prisoners doubled in agony and further dehydrated from the lack of clean water. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and simple infections that might have been curable in the outside world became death sentences inside the camp. Corpses piled in corners as there was no longer manpower or energy to bury them. Prisoners, forced to live side by side with the dead, began to lose their sense of boundaries between life and death. In this overcrowded hell, disease became not an outbreak, but the defining condition of existence. To sick, the death marches that funneled prisoners into Bergen-Belsen added layers of trauma to the already unbearable situation. Survivors staggered in, their feet frostbitten, their bodies scarred from days of walking without food or shelter. Many collapsed upon arrival and died before they could be registered. Others brought harrowing stories of executions along the road, of friends shot for lagging behind, and of endless columns trudging through snow under guard dogs and rifles. Bergen-Belsen became a graveyard of memories as well as bodies, each arrival carrying stories of suffering that merged into the collective nightmare of the camp. Prisoners who had endured months of survival in other camps now faced conditions even worse, as though the very end of the war was also the darkest moment of their captivity. The overcrowding magnified despair, making every act of endurance seem futile. The camp was not just holding prisoners anymore, it was swallowing them whole. The SS officers, overwhelmed but unrepentant, adopted a policy of indifference that condemned thousands more to death. Joseph Kramer, the camp commandant, stood at the center of this disaster, yet he refused to request meaningful aid or intervene to improve conditions. His guards, including infamous figures such as Irma Grace and Elizabeth Volkenrath, continued their reign of cruelty with sadistic efficiency. Beatings, arbitrary punishments, and executions did not lessen during the overcrowding. Rather, they added another layer of brutality to the already unbearable conditions. Prisoners who were too weak to stand during roll calls were kicked, beaten, or left to die in the mud. In the barracks, women reported being assaulted by guards, even as they lay dying of disease. The overcrowding, instead of generating pity or mercy, seemed to embolden the staff's cruelty. Bergen-Belsen in 1945 became both a warehouse of death and a theatre of deliberate dehumanization. The overcrowding also transformed Bergen-Belsen into a site of unimaginable psychological torment. The soundscape of the camp became an endless chorus of coughing, groaning, and the cries of the dying. Sleep was almost impossible, with disease-ridden bodies tossing beside one another on filthy straw. Parents watched helplessly as their children wasted away, and children saw their parents reduced to corpses within days of arrival. The boundaries of morality blurred as starvation forced some to steal bread from the dying or to look away from suffering they could not prevent. Hope, already fragile, eroded under the sheer weight of overcrowding, leaving prisoners suspended between the instinct to survive and the longing for release in death. This psychological collapse was as devastating as the physical one, eroding the last fragments of identity and dignity. Bergen-Belsen became a nightmare in which the human soul itself seemed under siege. By the spring of 1945, the overcrowding had transformed Bergen-Belsen into a place of death on a scale almost unimaginable. Tens of thousands perished in those final months, their bodies heaped in piles around the camp, awaiting burial that rarely came. The SS, faced with their collapsing Reich, had no intention of saving the lives under their watch, and instead allowed Bergen-Belsen to become a microcosm of the regime's downfall. For the prisoners inside, overcrowding was not simply a logistical crisis. It was a weapon of annihilation. It stripped them of health, space, food, and humanity, until the camp itself became synonymous with despair. As Allied forces closed in, Bergen-Belsen stood as a horrifying testament to the chaos of the Reich's collapse, a place where thousands died not in gas chambers but in the suffocating crush of bodies, disease, and neglect. The overcrowding of 1945 would ensure that Bergen-Belsen's name would be remembered not for survival, but for the sheer scale of human ruin it represented. By the opening months of 1945, Bergen-Belsen had descended into an abyss of human suffering, its physical space transformed into a graveyard for the living. The influx of transports from camps near the collapsing Eastern Front flooded the compound with thousands of emaciated bodies, each carrying disease and despair. The camp, already lacking food, medicine, and clean water, became the perfect breeding ground for epidemics. Typhus raged uncontrollably, carried by lice, and spread with terrifying efficiency among prisoners who lacked even the strength to scratch at their sores. Dysentery spread through contaminated water, leaving countless prisoners writhing in agony. Pneumonia and tuberculosis struck those whose immune systems had long since been broken down by hunger. Every new day brought the arrival of trains packed with more skeletal survivors, and every new morning revealed corpses lying where they had fallen. The atmosphere was thick with the stench of death, a smell that clung to the very air, inescapable and suffocating. Guards stopped bothering to collect the bodies, leaving them to rot among the living, a ghastly reminder of what awaited. For many, Bergen-Belsen had ceased to be a concentration camp, and had become instead a waiting room for death. Starvation was the most silent and merciless executioner. Food rations, already meagre in earlier years, dwindled to almost nothing as the Reich itself starved under the strain of total war. Prisoners received watery soup with scarcely any nutritional value, sometimes accompanied by a crust of bread that had to be divided among several. The hunger was unrelenting, gnawing constantly at bodies already reduced to skin and bone. Men and women scoured the filthy ground for discarded potato peels or scraps of grass, anything that could trick their stomachs into a fleeting sense of fullness. Mothers watched their children's bellies swell grotesquely from malnutrition, while their limbs withered away. Hunger madness drove some to steal food from the dead or from fellow prisoners, risking brutal punishment if caught. Guards often used food as a cruel weapon, taunting starving prisoners with morsels they would never receive. Many died not from sudden violence, but from the slow grinding process of wasting away, their organs failing one by one. By March 1945, starvation claimed thousands each week, adding to the daily tally of unburied corpses. Disease spread with relentless speed, weaving its way through the barracks where bodies lay packed together like sardines. The lice that carried typhus found endless hosts, moving from one weakened body to another with ease. Dysentery turned the wooden floors into cesspools of filth, as prisoners too weak to walk collapsed where they lay. The camp's water supply, contaminated by both sewage and the unburied dead, ensured that every sip was a gamble with infection. Prisoners often lacked the strength to crawl to the latrines, and soon the barracks themselves became chambers of disease. Doctors imprisoned in the camp, some of them once renowned physicians, tried to treat patients with nothing more than rags and scraps, their hands tied by the complete absence of medicine. Typhus fever burned through thousands, driving many into delirium before death carried them off. The SS themselves began to fear the epidemic, avoiding close contact with prisoners, yet still withholding medical supplies. In this chaos, death was no longer counted in individual lives, but in heaps of bodies. The very ground of Bergen-Belsen became poisoned by the plague of decay. The camp, incapable of absorbing its swelling population, became an open-air morgue. Corpses lay in piles between barracks, stacked like logs, some stripped of clothing by desperate prisoners in need of rags for warmth. Rats and crows feasted on the remains, adding to the horror of the spectacle. Living prisoners were often forced to sleep beside the dead, too weak to move them, their minds numbed by the normalization of death. Children stumbled over corpses in their search for scraps of food, their young eyes already hardened to the grotesque. Guards occasionally forced inmates to drag bodies into mass pits, but soon even this macabre routine broke down. The pits overflowed, and bodies remained unburied, creating a landscape of decay. The smell clung to skin, hair, and clothing, branding everyone within the wire as inhabitants of death itself. Eyewitnesses later recalled that Bergen-Belsen no longer resembled a camp, but a vision of hell manifested on earth. Life and death merged into one indistinguishable existence. For those still breathing, survival felt like a punishment. By March and April of 1945, Bergen-Belsen was losing over 500 lives each day, an avalanche of death that no one could stop. Prisoners awoke to find their bunkmates dead, their bodies stiff and cold, only to collapse themselves hours later. Some prisoners attempted to keep count of the dead, scratching numbers into walls or whispering totals to each other. But the figures soon became meaningless. Death was everywhere, in every barrack, on every path, in every whispered prayer. The SS no longer made serious efforts to conceal the catastrophe. They themselves were overwhelmed by the scale of collapse. Trucks designed to transport food now carried heaps of corpses, spilling limbs as they rumbled toward mass graves. Survivors recalled the eerie silence broken only by groans and the shuffle of weakened feet, punctuated by the occasional crack of a guard's whip. Even the strongest prisoners succumbed, their bodies shutting down under the weight of hunger and disease. Families were erased overnight, their last traces swallowed by the mass pits. Bergen-Belsen had become, in every way but official designation, a death camp. The psychological toll was equally catastrophic. Prisoners no longer cried out when a loved one died. Grief itself had been starved away. Many moved like ghosts, hollow-eyed, their humanity stripped down to the instinct for survival. Others gave up entirely, sitting motionless, until death claimed them. Hope became a dangerous luxury, a reminder of life beyond the wire that only deepened the pain. Those who clung to it often did so through prayer, whispered songs, or the faint memory of a family meal long past. Mothers tried to comfort children with stories of food and freedom, knowing they would never see those promises fulfilled. Prisoners watched their own reflection vanish from their faces, seeing only the skeletal mask of the camp staring back. Suicide became a silent choice for some, stepping into danger rather than enduring another day of agony. Survivors later spoke of how the will to live was tested more cruelly than the body itself. In Bergen-Belsen, to live meant to endure a nightmare without end. Even within the horror, fragments of human solidarity flickered faintly. Prisoners shared their last crumbs of bread, or shielded the sick from guards. Some doctors risked their own frail health to treat others, cleaning wounds with cold water and offering words of encouragement that carried more weight than medicine. Children clung together in small groups, forming fragile bonds of protection in a world without safety. Prisoners sometimes carried the dying so they would not die alone, offering the comfort of touch in a place designed to erase tenderness. Faith communities, despite their decimation, continued secret prayers, reminding each other that humanity had not entirely been extinguished. These acts of defiance, though small, stood as final protests against the dehumanization imposed by the SS. They also revealed the resilience of the human spirit, refusing to yield entirely even in the darkest depths. Yet for each act of solidarity, hundreds more perished unseen, their stories buried in silence. Bergen-Belsen became a paradox, a place of ultimate despair, and yet, at rare moments, a flicker of human resistance. By the eve of liberation in April 1945, Bergen-Belsen had become synonymous with unrestrained catastrophe. Over 35,000 prisoners perished in just a few months, their lives consumed by starvation, disease, and neglect. The camp systems had collapsed completely, leaving chaos in place of structure. Even the SS guards recognized that Bergen-Belsen was no longer functioning as intended, yet they continued to enforce suffering until the last days. For the prisoners who survived, every heartbeat was both a victory and a torment. They lived surrounded by death so vast it defied comprehension. Survivors later testified that liberation felt almost unreal because they had already come to believe that no end could ever arrive. The images recorded by liberating soldiers revealed scenes so shocking they stunned the world, laying bare the catastrophe of Bergen-Belsen. It was not simply a camp, it was a wound on the conscience of humanity. And in the spring of 1945, that wound was still bleeding, its toll beyond calculation. On the morning of April 15, 1945, soldiers of the British 11th Armoured Division entered the gates of Bergen-Belsen, unaware of the horror awaiting them. What they encountered was not merely a prison, but a landscape of death and despair. Over 60,000 skeletal prisoners staggered about, many too weak to speak or even stand. Surrounding them were more than 13,000 unburied corpses, strewn across the ground in grotesque heaps. The stench of decomposition filled the air, choking soldiers and survivors alike with a smell that could never be forgotten. British troops were hardened from years of war, yet what they saw defied all expectation. Men and women with hollow eyes reached out, some collapsing in exhaustion before help could arrive. Starved children clung to strangers, crying without tears because dehydration had robbed their bodies of fluid. Every step revealed another grotesque tableau of suffering, confirming that the camp had become a factory of death through starvation and disease. The first moments of liberation were defined not by triumph, but by overwhelming shock and sorrow. The British officers immediately realized they had stumbled upon a humanitarian catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. Bergen-Belsen had been officially designated a concentration camp, not an extermination center, yet the sight before them resembled the aftermath of genocide. The camp's infrastructure had completely collapsed in the preceding months. There were no working water supplies, food distribution had ceased, and sanitation was non-existent. Prisoners wandered aimlessly between piles of corpses, their frail bodies unable to comprehend that salvation had finally arrived. The soldiers were struck by how life and death coexisted side by side. One prisoner whispered a faint thank you while another fell lifeless into the dirt. The sheer scale of suffering defied logic, and no amount of military training could prepare these men for such a vision. Their mission shifted instantly from combat to crisis response, as they realized that victory over the Nazis carried with it an unforeseen responsibility to save the remnants of a dying population. Liberation was no longer an act of war, it was an act of rescue. The medical situation inside Bergen-Belsen was catastrophic. Typhus had spread uncontrollably through the camp, carried by lice and worsened by the lack of hygiene. Dysentery, tuberculosis, and starvation further ravaged the weakened bodies of prisoners, turning them into little more than living skeletons. The British soldiers quickly summoned medical teams, who were horrified by what they encountered. Doctors described bodies weighing scarcely more than 60 pounds, with skin stretched tightly over bones. Some prisoners, too weak to recognize that help had come, simply lay in silence, waiting for death. Others tried desperately to stand, eager to greet their liberators, but collapsed in exhaustion before they could utter a word. The medical officers noted that even when food was given, many prisoners could not digest it, their bodies having consumed their own organs in the final stages of starvation. The camp was not merely a scene of past suffering, it was an active catastrophe unfolding in real time. Saving lives would require urgent, unprecedented measures. As the British surveyed the camp, they were confronted with the logistical nightmare of dealing with the dead. Thousands of corpses lay in ditches, beside barracks and across open fields, creating an atmosphere of constant dread. Many of the dead were naked, their clothing stolen by others desperate for warmth. British soldiers, hardened by years of fighting, were visibly shaken as they loaded bodies into mass graves, often using bulldozers to move the overwhelming numbers. Survivors watched in silence, some too numb to weep, others whispering the names of loved ones as they disappeared into the earth. The task was overwhelming. Every day revealed more bodies hidden beneath collapsed bunks or buried in shallow pits. This was not a camp in need of liberation. It was a graveyard in desperate need of order. The act of burying the dead became one of the first responsibilities of the liberators, a grim duty necessary to restore even the most basic sense of dignity to the countless lives extinguished within Bergen-Belsen. Among the survivors, reactions to liberation varied widely. Some broke down in tears of gratitude, clinging to the uniforms of their rescuers as though afraid the miracle might vanish. Others stared blankly, unable to process what was happening, their minds shattered by years of suffering. There were even those who expressed guilt at surviving when so many had perished, a haunting psychological burden that would remain with them for life. The British soldiers, many barely older than the prisoners they saved, struggled to reconcile the enormity of what they witnessed. Letters written home in the following days often described the camp as a vision of hell on earth. Some soldiers admitted to being haunted by nightmares for the rest of their lives, the images of skeletal children and emaciated corpses etched permanently into their memories. For survivors, liberation was not an immediate return to life, but the beginning of a painful, uncertain recovery. They were free, yet trapped within bodies and minds broken by unimaginable cruelty. The camp staff were quickly detained by the British, including notorious figures like Joseph Kramer and Irma Grace. Survivors pointed them out with trembling fingers, their rage simmering beneath the exhaustion of survival. The British soldiers forced the SS guards to help bury the dead, a symbolic act meant to confront them with the consequences of their crimes. Many guards protested, claiming they had only followed orders, but their hollow words carried no weight in the face of the overwhelming evidence. Witnessing their captors reduced to powerless figures offered survivors a small measure of vindication, though it could never erase the horrors endured. Liberation meant justice was finally at hand, but it also laid bare the scale of the crime committed. The world would soon know the names of these perpetrators, their faces burned into public memory as symbols of cruelty. Bergen-Belsen had not been hidden. It had been exposed for all to see. The reckoning had begun. The British Army immediately documented the conditions of Bergen-Belsen to ensure that no one could ever deny what they had seen. Photographs, films, and eyewitness accounts were recorded in harrowing detail. These images would later shock the world when broadcast to the public, becoming some of the most infamous evidence of Nazi crimes. The sight of emaciated prisoners, piles of corpses, and the sheer scale of death silenced skeptics and galvanized international outrage. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen thus became more than a military event. It became a moral turning point. It was no longer possible to ignore or downplay the atrocities of the concentration camp system. Survivors' testimonies began to be collected, their voices breaking through the silence imposed by years of oppression. In the weeks that followed, the camp became both a hospital and a crime scene, a place of recovery and of reckoning. Liberation, therefore, was not simply an end but a beginning, the beginning of remembering, documenting, and demanding justice. For many survivors, liberation was bittersweet, as joy was tempered by unbearable loss. Families had been destroyed, children orphaned, and communities erased forever. Even as medical teams worked tirelessly, thousands continued to die in the weeks following April 15th, too weak to recover despite receiving care. These post-liberation deaths added another tragic layer to the story of Bergen-Belsen, underscoring that liberation came too late for many. Still, those who survived carried the responsibility of memory, ensuring that the truth of Bergen-Belsen would not fade into silence. The British soldiers who bore witness likewise carried that responsibility, their testimony forming a vital part of history. The liberation of Bergen-Belsen was one of the darkest revelations of the Second World War, a stark reminder of the human capacity for cruelty and neglect. Yet it was also a moment of undeniable humanity, as strangers reached out to save one another in the face of despair. Out of horror came resilience, and from silence came a demand that the world never forget. When the British forces first grasped the enormity of what lay inside Bergen-Belsen, shock quickly gave way to an urgent sense of responsibility. The soldiers had not been trained for humanitarian crises on such a scale, yet they now faced the immediate challenge of saving tens of thousands of lives. Medics, many no older than the prisoners they sought to heal, arrived with little equipment and confronted diseases they had rarely encountered before. The stench of death was overwhelming, and the living mingled with corpses, creating conditions that made triage almost impossible. British officers recalled the moment as one of paralysis, where every decision felt inadequate in the face of unrelenting suffering. There was no clear system, no precedent to guide them, only instinct and determination. The soldiers realized that even the most basic resources, food, water, and medicine, were woefully insufficient for the scale of need. Many of the survivors were so malnourished that their stomachs could not tolerate normal rations, and initial attempts at feeding sometimes proved fatal. In those first hours, compassion and horror existed side by side, each pushing the rescuers to act despite the insurmountable odds. Bergen-Belsen had become both a battlefield and a hospital, a place where the war against death itself had only just begun. The first priority was to separate the living from the dead, a task as grim as it was necessary. Corpses lay in open ditches, in the wooden barracks, and sprawled across the muddy ground where they had fallen. Soldiers donned makeshift masks, and bulldozers were brought in to push bodies into mass graves, a process that horrified the liberators but was unavoidable given the conditions. The British commanders feared epidemics would spread not only among survivors, but also to their own men. Burning and burying the dead became a central operation, carried out with solemn efficiency under the gaze of hollow-eyed survivors. Some prisoners, too weak to move, watched as the bodies of their relatives disappeared into the earth, their grief swallowed by numb exhaustion. For the liberators, each shovel of soil or heap of lime symbolized both defeat and duty, a desperate measure to restore some semblance of order. Chaplains recited prayers as trucks dumped body after body into the pits, trying to inject dignity into an act that otherwise felt mechanical. The ground of Belsen became a vast cemetery, one that bore silent testimony to the cruelty of neglect and the collapse of humanity. Soldiers later admitted that these images never left their minds, haunting them long after they returned home. Medical treatment quickly revealed itself as an overwhelming challenge. Typhus, dysentery, tuberculosis, and starvation combined in lethal fashion, producing a mortality rate that defied even the best efforts of doctors. Makeshift hospitals were established in nearby German military barracks, hastily converted to accommodate the sick and dying. Field hospitals overflowed with skeletal figures, their bodies little more than skin stretched over bone. Doctors had to ration penicillin, sulfur drugs, and quinine, choosing which patients might benefit most. Some prisoners were so far gone that no medicine could save them, their organs too ravaged by months of starvation. Nurses and medics often wept openly, torn between professional detachment and the human instinct to grieve. Simple acts, like offering sips of clean water or broth, became monumental gestures of mercy. Yet even as lives were saved, the death toll continued to rise each day, a grim reminder of the lateness of liberation. For survivors, every breath was a gamble, a precarious step away from the abyss that had consumed so many. Among the survivors, psychological wounds were as deep as physical ones. Many could not comprehend that they were finally free, staring blankly at their rescuers as if waiting for another order, another blow. Some survivors clung desperately to British soldiers, unable to believe that these men meant them no harm. Others wandered aimlessly through the camp, still in shock, searching for family members who were long gone. Children, reduced to silence by trauma, sometimes refused to eat, their minds frozen in the routines of deprivation. The British tried to establish order by organizing groups, distributing clothing, and creating a semblance of daily structure. But trauma revealed itself in unexpected ways, sudden outbursts of anger, uncontrollable weeping, or total withdrawal into silence. To the rescuers, it was clear that survival did not end with liberation. It only began anew in the difficult path of recovery. Prisoners had to relearn trust, hope, and the idea that life might continue beyond the barbed wire. For many, those first days were a strange limbo, a twilight between horror and the possibility of healing. Feeding survivors became a delicate and tragic task. British soldiers, horrified by the condition of the inmates, initially gave them army rations, bread, canned meat, and chocolate. Yet the emaciated bodies could not handle such rich food, leading to sudden deaths from refeeding syndrome. Medical staff quickly adjusted, developing Belsen mixtures of porridge, milk, and diluted soup, carefully introduced to stabilize the starving bodies. Lines of skeletal prisoners waited patiently, some collapsing before receiving their portion, others clutching every morsel as though it were life itself. Nurses recalled how some survivors tried to hoard food under mattresses, unwilling to believe that tomorrow would bring more. Hunger had redefined their instincts, and breaking that fear required not only nourishment but reassurance. British officers noted the quiet dignity with which many survivors accepted these rations, offering thanks even in whispers of exhaustion. Still, every distribution of food was shadowed by tragedy, as some could not recover despite the best care. Feeding became not merely an act of sustenance but a profound ritual of restoring humanity. As the camp transformed under British control, a new paradox emerged. It was still a place of mass death, even after liberation. Despite every effort, an estimated 14,000 survivors perished in the weeks following the British arrival. The medical crisis was simply too great, and resources too scarce, to save all those who had been pushed past the limits of survival. Hospitals filled with the sound of labored breathing and whispered prayers, punctuated by the silence of yet another death. The British soldiers, who had marched into the camp as liberators, now found themselves overwhelmed by the relentless tide of mortality. They buried their dead each morning, only to see new patients succumb by evening. Each loss weighed heavily on the morale of the rescuers, who struggled with feelings of helplessness and despair. Yet amidst the grief, successes shone brightly, individual survivors who recovered, who smiled faintly after their first proper meal, who whispered their gratitude. These fragile victories became the emotional lifeline for the men and women working against impossible odds. Bergen-Belsen, even in its liberation, remained a battlefield between death and life. The British also faced the grim task of confronting the perpetrators who had overseen this catastrophe. SS guards and camp personnel were rounded up, forced to confront the horrors they had helped create. Some were compelled to bury the bodies or witness the suffering they had ignored, a symbolic reversal of power. For the liberators, this act was both justice and necessity, ensuring the world knew that responsibility would not be erased. Soldiers documented everything with film and photographs, determined that no one could deny what they had seen. These records later formed part of the evidence at war crimes trials, ensuring that Belsen's truth would echo across history. For the survivors, watching their tormentors stripped of authority provided a bitter, fleeting sense of justice. Yet many felt it could never balance the scale of their suffering or bring back the dead. Bergen-Belsen had become more than a camp. It was a crime scene, a place where every corner whispered testimony. The aftermath was as much about accountability as it was about relief. In the weeks that followed, Bergen-Belsen transformed from a place of despair to one of fragile recovery. Survivors were gradually moved to displaced persons camps, where they began the slow process of rebuilding their shattered lives. The British established order, burned the disease-ridden huts, and sought to erase the physical remnants of contamination. Yet the memory of those days lingered in every soldier and every liberated prisoner, an indelible scar. For many survivors, Bergen-Belsen remained the defining shadow of their lives, a reminder of both horror and deliverance. The British, too, carried the weight of what they had witnessed, often struggling to speak of it after returning home. The camp became a symbol of the Holocaust's hidden cruelties, those not killed in gas chambers, but slowly destroyed by hunger, disease, and neglect. Liberation was not a single event but an extended ordeal, stretching long after the gates were opened. Bergen-Belsen's aftermath revealed both the resilience of the human spirit and the depth of the human capacity for cruelty. It stood as both a graveyard and a beginning, where life clawed its way back from the brink. In the months following the liberation of Bergen-Belsen, the world demanded justice for the horrors uncovered in its barbed wire confines. The British military, who had stumbled upon the camp in April 1945, bore the responsibility not only for aiding the survivors, but also for holding the perpetrators accountable. The decision was made to conduct trials at Lüneburg, Germany, only a few miles from the camp itself, so that the crimes could be judged in the shadow of their commission. These trials would later be known as the Belsen trials, and they marked one of the earliest efforts to establish legal responsibility for crimes against humanity. The accused included former camp commandants, guards, medical staff, and administrative personnel, numbering nearly 50 individuals. Among them were notorious figures such as Josef Kramer, the so-called Beast of Belsen, and Irma Grace, often referred to as the Hyena of Auschwitz. The legal framework was still evolving, and the British military courts relied on both international law and the evidence of survivors to construct their cases. The trial opened on September 17, 1945, drawing the attention of journalists, survivors, and military observers from around the world. The atmosphere was somber, the proceedings deliberate, and every testimony carried the weight of thousands of silenced voices. Josef Kramer sat at the center of the dock, his expression cold and detached, as witnesses described his role in orchestrating mass suffering. Kramer had previously served as commandant at Auschwitz before being transferred to Bergen-Belsen in late 1944, where his cruelty intensified as conditions deteriorated. Survivors spoke of his indifference to starvation, his orders to withhold food, and his personal participation in acts of violence. The court heard harrowing testimony about how Kramer oversaw the camp as tens of thousands died in early 1945, his authority extending over both SS guards and prisoner functionaries. His physical presence in the courtroom, a man who appeared ordinary, almost bureaucratic, stood in chilling contrast to the enormity of his crimes. Prosecutors emphasized that Kramer had not only permitted but encouraged conditions that led to catastrophic death tolls. Witnesses recounted him walking among emaciated prisoners with no sign of compassion, ensuring that order was maintained even as bodies piled up. His insistence that he was merely following orders rang hollow against the avalanche of evidence. The British judges and prosecutors made clear, command carried responsibility, and indifference was itself a crime. Irma Grace, barely in her early 20s, emerged as one of the most infamous figures of the trial. Known for her striking appearance and chilling cruelty, she had served as a guard at both Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen. Survivors described her brutal beatings, her use of a whip, and her sadistic delight in tormenting women prisoners. Testimonies revealed that Grace often selected prisoners for punishment arbitrarily, using fear as a weapon as much as physical violence. What unsettled observers most was her lack of remorse and her cold demeanor throughout the proceedings. Journalists wrote about her smiling at inappropriate moments or maintaining a posture of arrogance even as survivors recounted her brutality. Prosecutors portrayed her as an example of how ideology, combined with youthful zeal and unchecked authority, could create a figure capable of monstrous cruelty. Her very presence on trial became symbolic of the complicity of women within the machinery of the Holocaust. Grace's defense claimed she was only a low-level guard without power to change the system, but the testimonies painted her as an active participant in atrocities. Her name would remain etched in history as one of the most notorious female perpetrators of Nazi crimes. The trial did not focus only on the most infamous figures, but also brought to account dozens of lesser-known SS guards and camp personnel. Each defendant faced charges of war crimes, including participation in murder, mistreatment, and neglect that led to the deaths of countless prisoners. Nurses and doctors who had withheld medical treatment, guards who had beaten prisoners, and administrators who facilitated starvation all stood in the dock. The British prosecutors presented evidence methodically, ensuring that the trial was not only about assigning blame, but also about creating a detailed record of the crimes committed at Bergen-Belsen. Survivors gave testimony after testimony, recounting the daily horrors of life in the camp and pointing out perpetrators they remembered. Some defendants attempted to shift responsibility onto their superiors, insisting they had no choice but to follow orders. Others claimed ignorance of the worst conditions, an argument that collapsed under the overwhelming testimonies of survivors. The courtroom became a place where excuses were stripped away, revealing the reality that cruelty had been woven into the daily functioning of the camp. The Belsen trials thus served as an early model of collective accountability. The legal process was groundbreaking, though not without its difficulties. International law had not yet fully developed the concept of crimes against humanity, so prosecutors relied on existing frameworks of war crimes and violations of the laws of war. The British courts faced the challenge of establishing guilt in crimes that often lacked written orders or direct documentation, relying instead on survivor testimony and circumstantial evidence. Still, the testimonies were compelling, with survivors identifying guards and recalling specific incidents with haunting clarity. Witnesses described watching loved ones beaten to death, starved to the point of collapse, or left untreated in barracks overflowing with disease. The court wrestled with questions of individual versus collective guilt. Could a cook, a nurse, or a clerk be as guilty as a commandant or a sadistic guard? Ultimately, the verdicts would establish an important precedent. Participation in a system of organized cruelty was itself culpability. These legal decisions would echo into the later Nuremberg trials, influencing how the world approached the prosecution of crimes of mass atrocity. The atmosphere of the trial was heavy with both grief and determination. Survivors, many still weak from their time in the camp, sat in the courtroom and relived their trauma in order to give voice to those who had perished. Journalists reported on the emotional weight of their testimonies, which often brought the entire room to silence. Some accounts described the stench of death at Belsen, the sight of corpses stacked like wood, and the endless cries of starving children. Others spoke of the psychological torment, of being treated as less than human, stripped of names and reduced to numbers. The courage of survivors who took the stand gave the trial a moral force that extended beyond legal arguments. Their words ensured that Bergen-Belsen would not be remembered solely through statistics, but through the human suffering etched into memory. The trial thus became both a judicial process and an act of historical preservation. Each testimony was a fragment of truth, pieced together to build an undeniable record of atrocity. The POWs. When the verdicts were delivered in November 1945, justice was both swift and symbolic. 11 of the defendants, including Joseph Kramer and Irma Grace, were sentenced to death by hanging. Others received long prison sentences, reflecting varying degrees of culpability. Some were acquitted due to lack of evidence, though their acquittals did little to erase suspicion about their involvement. The executions were carried out in December 1945, marking a decisive act of accountability in the immediate aftermath of the war. For many survivors, the punishments offered a measure of closure, though nothing could restore the lives lost. The British courts had shown the world that crimes of such magnitude would not go unpunished. Yet the trials also sparked debate: were the sentences sufficient, or could justice ever truly match the scale of the crimes? What was certain was that the Belsen trials helped establish the principle that individuals, regardless of rank or position, could not hide behind the excuse of obedience. This precedent would resonate in international law for decades to come. Deuces. The legacy of the Belsen trials extended far beyond the walls of the courtroom in Lüneburg. They marked one of the earliest attempts to grapple with the concept of systemic evil, where responsibility lay not only with leaders, but also with those who enabled and carried out their commands. The trials set the stage for the more famous Nuremberg trials, which would expand upon these principles and address the broader machinery of Nazi crimes. Bergen-Belsen, once a place of silence and death, thus became central to a new chapter of international justice. The world learned that atrocity could not be erased by the collapse of a regime or the death of its leaders. It had to be confronted through law and memory. Survivors carried the scars of the camp, but they also carried the knowledge that their testimonies had helped ensure accountability. The Belsen trials remain a reminder that even in the aftermath of overwhelming horror, humanity can seek truth, establish justice, and resist forgetting. They were not perfect, but they were necessary, and they became an enduring symbol of the world's first steps toward reckoning with genocide. When the gates of Bergen-Belsen were finally opened by British soldiers in April 1945, freedom did not mean an immediate return to life as it once was. Survivors, skeletal and broken, carried scars far deeper than the visible wounds of starvation and disease. Many could barely stand, let alone imagine a future beyond the camp's barbed wire fences. Liberation was only the first step in an uncertain and painful journey toward survival in a world that had shifted beyond recognition. Families were shattered, entire communities had been wiped from existence, and survivors often found themselves utterly alone. Many searched desperately for loved ones, scanning Red Cross lists and aid agency bulletins, clinging to fading hope. For some, reunion came as a miracle. For many others, the realization of permanent loss was another devastating blow. Even as food, shelter, and medical care were gradually restored, survivors faced an existential question: how to live after enduring the machinery of death. The camp had defined their every breath for years, and now a new and unfamiliar freedom weighed heavily. To move forward, survivors would have to navigate grief, resilience, and the challenge of rejoining a fractured world. In the weeks following liberation, the British Army and aid organizations transformed the nearby Wehrmacht barracks into displaced persons camps. Here survivors received food, clothing, and medical treatment, but they also began the fragile process of rebuilding their identities. Doctors fought to save thousands suffering from typhus and malnutrition, but equally urgent was the need for psychological healing. For many, speaking about their trauma was nearly impossible, their voices silenced by horror and fear. Yet slowly testimonies emerged in whispered conversations, diary entries, and letters written to the few family members who remained alive. Survivors clung to faith, to cultural traditions, and to fragile bonds of friendship forged in the camps. In these makeshift communities, marriages were celebrated, children were born, and even laughter occasionally returned, faint and hesitant. These moments were not just signs of resilience, but acts of defiance against the destruction the Nazis had intended. The displaced persons camps became laboratories of hope, fragile but determined, where survivors began piecing together shattered lives. Each step forward was a reminder that survival itself was an act of resistance. The search for lost relatives consumed countless survivors in the aftermath of Bergen-Belsen. Red Cross agencies, Jewish relief organizations, and military archives became the epicenters of desperate inquiries. Survivors wrote letters by the thousands, hoping to find brothers, sisters, spouses, or parents scattered across the ruins of Europe. Many traveled from camp to camp, chasing rumors of someone who might have survived Auschwitz, Dachau, or Theresienstadt. Every reunion was a moment of light amid darkness, but every confirmation of death was another wound added to already broken hearts. Some survivors eventually accepted that they were the last living links to entire family lines. This profound loneliness shaped their post-war identities, burdening them with the responsibility of memory. They became the keepers of names, traditions, and stories that would otherwise have vanished into silence. Their survival meant carrying the weight of remembrance, a duty that was both sacred and painful. To survive was not only to live, but also to ensure that those who perished would never be forgotten. As survivors attempted to reintegrate into civilian life, they encountered societies unwilling or unable to grasp the magnitude of what they had endured. In many parts of Europe, anti-Semitism persisted, making the return to former homes dangerous or impossible. Some survivors who attempted to reclaim property or livelihoods were met with hostility and rejection. For many, there was nothing to return to. Villages had been destroyed, businesses confiscated, and communities erased. In response, survivors sought new beginnings in places far from the killing grounds of Europe. Large numbers emigrated to Palestine, where they joined the struggle for the creation of Israel, driven by a need for safety and belonging. Others traveled to the United States, Canada, South America, and Australia, building new lives in foreign lands. Adapting to these new worlds was not easy, as language barriers and cultural differences posed daily challenges. Yet survivors carried within them an unmatched determination, rooted in the knowledge that they had already overcome the unimaginable. The act of rebuilding was itself a triumph against the Nazis' vision of annihilation. Psychological trauma accompanied survivors long after the war ended, shaping every aspect of their post-war existence. Many suffered from nightmares, flashbacks, and debilitating anxiety, long before the term post-traumatic stress disorder was widely understood. The memory of hunger haunted survivors, leading some to hoard food, while others struggled with eating altogether. Physical illnesses, scars from beatings, and chronic ailments from starvation remained as constant reminders of camp life. For many women, sexual violence endured in the camps left deep emotional wounds, rarely spoken of, but ever present. Children who survived often carried a silence into adulthood, having lost formative years to brutality and chaos. Yet even within this shadow, resilience emerged, as survivors created families and careers despite their scars. Some chose to speak openly about their experiences, turning their pain into education and warning for future generations. Others remained silent, choosing private remembrance over public testimony. Both paths represented a deeply personal negotiation with trauma, one that never truly ended. Education and testimony became powerful tools for many survivors in the decades after liberation. As the world began to forget, they stepped forward to ensure that memory endured. Survivors wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and visited schools to share their stories, their voices breaking through decades of silence. Figures like Elie Wiesel and Primo Levi became symbols of this responsibility, but thousands of lesser-known voices contributed to a global chorus of remembrance. Each testimony was more than history. It was a plea for vigilance, a warning against the dangers of hatred and indifference. Survivors knew that if they did not speak, the truth of Bergen-Belsen and camps like it might fade into obscurity or denial. Their words became a moral foundation for Holocaust education worldwide, shaping how future generations understood genocide. Museums, memorials, and documentaries drew heavily upon these testimonies, amplifying voices once nearly erased. In this way, survivors transformed their suffering into a legacy of truth. Their survival ensured that the world could never again claim ignorance. Despite the weight of memory, survivors also found moments of renewal and joy in their post-war lives. Many built families, raising children and grandchildren who became living testaments to resilience. Weddings celebrated in displaced persons camps or new homelands symbolized life triumphing over death. Careers were forged in medicine, law, academia, and the arts, where survivors contributed richly to their adopted societies. Some survivors even became leaders in their communities, advocating for human rights and justice. Their success was not a negation of trauma, but proof of their strength in carrying it. Each achievement, graduations, marriages, births, was infused with meaning, reminders of the lives that the Nazis had tried to erase. Survivors lived not only for themselves, but also for those who could not. In the laughter of children, in the traditions preserved, in the milestones celebrated, they defied the silence of mass graves. Against all odds, they turned survival into renewal. Diaries. The story of Bergen-Belsen's survivors is not only one of trauma, but also of testament. They emerged from the abyss of human cruelty, carrying the responsibility of memory, justice, and resilience. Their lives became bridges between a shattered past and a hopeful future. They carried within them the voices of those who could no longer speak, ensuring that history would not dissolve into denial or forgetfulness. Through testimonies, education, and family legacies, they transformed unspeakable suffering into moral instruction for the world. Their resilience did not erase their pain, but redefined survival as a form of victory. In rebuilding their lives, survivors proved that the Nazis had failed in their ultimate goal of annihilation. Bergen-Belsen remained a scar in their memory, but it also became a foundation for stories of endurance. Each survivor's journey was unique, but collectively they became guardians of truth. Their survival reminds us that even amid the darkest chapters of history, humanity's capacity for renewal endures. In the years immediately after the war, Bergen-Belsen was not yet the solemn place of remembrance that visitors recognize today, but rather a desolate field marked by the traces of horror. British troops, overwhelmed by the scale of the catastrophe, burned down the wooden barracks to prevent the spread of disease, leaving behind an empty expanse that concealed the suffering once contained within its boundaries. Survivors, still haunted by the memory of skeletal figures and mass graves, feared that the world might too quickly forget what had transpired there. Initially, local authorities showed little initiative in commemorating the site, as post-war Germany struggled with devastation, denial, and the urgent need for reconstruction. Yet, Jewish organizations and survivors pressed for recognition, insisting that the memory of the dead deserved a dignified and lasting marker. Their voices carried not just the plea for remembrance, but also the demand for moral responsibility, a reminder that history could not simply be erased by bulldozers or silence. These early calls for preservation laid the foundation for what would later become a major center of Holocaust commemoration. It was the survivors themselves, more than any government authority, who became the guardians of memory in those fragile post-war years. Their efforts transformed Bergen-Belsen from an abandoned scar on the landscape into a symbol of enduring memory. Without them, the camp might have been swallowed by the indifference of time. The first significant act of remembrance came in 1952, when the state of Lower Saxony, together with Jewish communities, established a modest memorial on the site. The memorial was simple in design, a symbolic gesture rather than an architectural statement, but it marked an important turning point. For the first time, the German state publicly acknowledged Bergen-Belsen as a place of suffering and death, a space that demanded respect and preservation. Survivors gathered there for memorial ceremonies, reading prayers, reciting the Kaddish, and recalling the names of the dead who had no gravestones of their own. Over time, this early memorial became a pilgrimage site, visited not only by Jewish survivors, but also by representatives of other victim groups, including political prisoners and Roma communities. The humble beginnings of the memorial reflected a broader struggle. How could a society that had been complicit in such crimes confront its past openly? The answer was neither immediate nor easy, but each year more visitors arrived, and the site began to evolve into a permanent place of education and mourning. The modest stone structures that first marked Bergen-Belsen carried immense symbolic weight, serving as anchors of memory in a country where silence often threatened to overshadow remembrance. In 1966, the Bergen-Belsen Memorial officially opened as a dedicated institution, expanding beyond symbolic markers into a space of historical documentation and education. The memorial grounds included mass graves, each marked with stark stone slabs engraved with numbers representing the countless unidentified victims buried beneath them. These graves stood in silent testimony to the scale of loss, denying the possibility of erasure or denial. Within the newly established museum, photographs, testimonies, and documents were carefully curated to tell the story of the camp and its victims in detail. Unlike earlier memorials that relied heavily on symbolism, this was an attempt to combine memory with historical precision, making Bergen-Belsen both a place of mourning and a site of learning. Survivors often played a central role in guiding the development of exhibitions, ensuring that their lived experiences were preserved alongside the cold facts of history. Schools, universities, and international delegations began organizing visits, turning Bergen-Belsen into a cornerstone of Holocaust education. This institutional step cemented the camp's place not only in the history of Germany, but in the global narrative of the Holocaust. From this point forward, Bergen-Belsen was no longer a neglected scar, but a carefully maintained site of conscience. As decades passed, the Bergen-Belsen Memorial expanded in scope and depth, with renewed efforts to collect survivor testimonies and preserve artifacts from the camp. Historians and curators recognized that as survivors aged, their voices needed to be recorded urgently before they were lost forever. Oral history projects brought together hundreds of testimonies, ranging from diaries written in the camp to filmed interviews decades later, each adding texture and humanity to the history preserved on-site. The museum's exhibitions were redesigned to reflect evolving scholarship, highlighting not only the Jewish suffering, but also the broader diversity of victims, political prisoners, Soviet POWs, and others who perished within its fences. New multimedia displays allowed younger generations, often far removed from the events, to engage emotionally and intellectually with the past. This transformation reflected a growing understanding. Remembrance was not static, but required constant renewal to remain meaningful in changing times. Bergen-Belsen thus became a living memorial, one that adapted while remaining true to the moral imperative of never forgetting. Annual remembrance ceremonies at Bergen-Belsen became an integral part of its identity, drawing survivors, their families, dignitaries, and school groups to gather at the site. On April 15th, the anniversary of liberation, ceremonies often began at the mass graves, where wreaths were laid and prayers offered for the tens of thousands buried there. Survivors spoke to audiences filled with young students, recounting memories of starvation, disease, and despair, ensuring that the lessons of Bergen-Belsen were transmitted across generations. German officials, once hesitant, began to take part with increasing openness, acknowledging responsibility and pledging to preserve memory. These ceremonies were not mere formalities. They were powerful rituals of remembrance that reaffirmed the moral lessons drawn from the Holocaust. Survivors often described them as moments of both pain and healing, where grief for the past coexisted with hope that such horrors would never be repeated. The symbolism of these gatherings underscored that Bergen-Belsen was not only a place of history, but also a moral compass for the future. Each year, the voices of survivors echoed against the silent graves, a reminder that remembrance must be active, not passive. The Bergen-Belsen Memorial also became a center for international dialogue, visited by leaders from around the world who came to pay their respects. Prominent visits, such as that of Chancellor Willy Brandt and later international figures, symbolized the global recognition of Bergen-Belsen as a site of universal significance. These visits underscored that Bergen-Belsen was not merely a German issue, but a human one, resonating across national and cultural boundaries. Leaders who stood among the mass graves often spoke of the responsibility of all nations to confront hatred, prejudice, and genocide wherever they occur. The site became not only a place to honor the victims, but also a platform for discussions on human rights, tolerance, and the dangers of indifference. The presence of international delegations gave Bergen-Belsen a role that extended beyond remembrance. It became a warning and a lesson for the entire world. Each official who laid a wreath there contributed to the idea that memory is a shared global duty. The memorial thus stood as both a graveyard and a classroom, where the silence of the dead urged the living to act with conscience. By the 21st century, the memorial underwent major renovations, ensuring that its facilities met the demands of modern education and historical research. In 2007, a new documentation center opened, vastly expanding the museum's capacity to preserve and present the camp's history. This modern building, designed with minimalist architecture, emphasized simplicity and respect, creating spaces where the weight of history could be felt without distraction. Inside, digital archives, interactive exhibits, and extensive survivor testimonies allowed visitors to explore Bergen-Belsen in unprecedented depth. Historians used these resources to uncover new layers of the camp's history, while educators crafted programs that engaged students through dialogue and reflection. The inclusion of advanced technology ensured that even as living witnesses dwindled, their voices would remain present for future generations. The new documentation center marked a significant evolution. Bergen-Belsen was no longer only a site of mourning, but also a leading institution of Holocaust research and pedagogy. Through these efforts, the memory of Bergen-Belsen was preserved not as a relic of the past, but as a living, vital part of humanity's conscience. Today, Bergen-Belsen stands as one of the most important Holocaust memorials in the world, a place where memory, history, and moral responsibility converge. Visitors walking across its quiet grounds see the vast grassy fields where Barracks once stood, punctuated by stark stone markers over mass graves. The silence is heavy, broken only by the sound of footsteps and whispers of guides, recounting stories of unimaginable suffering. Within the museum, survivors' faces and voices continue to speak, reminding each visitor that history is not abstract but profoundly human. Bergen-Belsen serves as both a tribute to the dead and a warning to the living, demanding vigilance against prejudice, dehumanization, and indifference. Its memorial and museum embody the idea that remembrance is not about the past alone, but about shaping the moral choices of the present and future. Each year, thousands of students leave the site not only with knowledge, but with a deeper sense of empathy and responsibility. Bergen-Belsen's transformation from a place of horror to a beacon of remembrance reflects the determination of survivors and the commitment of societies to confront even their darkest histories. In its silence and its stories, Bergen-Belsen continues to speak, ensuring that the lessons carved into its soil remain alive for generations yet to come. Bergen-Belsen is more than a location on a map. It is a scar upon the conscience of humanity. When the name is spoken, it summons images of skeletal survivors, heaps of corpses, and a silence that screams louder than words. The camp's history has become a symbol not only of the cruelty of the Nazi regime, but also of the fragility of human civilization. What happened there was not inevitable, but a deliberate choice, orchestrated through ideology, bureaucracy, and blind obedience. Bergen-Belsen's legacy is one of stark warning, telling us what can happen when hatred is systematized and compassion is abandoned. Every barbed wire fence, every ruined barrack, and every mass grave whispers a reminder of how fragile moral boundaries can be. It is a place where the machinery of dehumanization reached its horrific conclusion. Bergen-Belsen is not just history, it is a mirror reflecting the worst impulses of mankind. Its legacy is a solemn call to vigilance, to ensure that such cruelty never rises again. For as survivors have said, to forget is to risk repetition. The legacy of Bergen-Belsen is anchored in the testimonies of those who endured its horrors. Survivors carried their memories across continents, determined to speak for the silenced millions. Their words became living monuments, more enduring than stone or steel. They told of starvation, disease, and despair, but also of fleeting moments of solidarity and the will to survive. These testimonies became central to Holocaust education, shaping how the world understood the enormity of what had taken place. Each diary, memoir, and recorded testimony is an act of resistance against forgetting. Survivors knew that silence would grant victory to the perpetrators, while memory would honor the dead. Through their voices, Bergen-Belsen became not just a site of horror, but a lesson in resilience. Their legacy is a reminder that memory itself is a form of justice. To forget would be to betray them a second time. Bergen-Belsen also shaped post-war justice, leaving a legacy in international law. The Belsen trials of 1945 were among the first attempts to hold perpetrators accountable for crimes against humanity. For the first time, the world witnessed the principle that individuals, not just states, could be held responsible for atrocities. The trials established precedents that rippled through subsequent tribunals, from Nuremberg to The Hague. Bergen-Belsen thus became a turning point in the pursuit of justice on a global scale. Its legacy was not only legal but moral, signaling that mass murder and cruelty would not be met with impunity. Though justice was imperfect, the trials represented a step toward a world where accountability mattered. They reinforced the principle that obedience to orders could not absolve responsibility. Bergen-Belsen became a courtroom in itself, a testimony to the world's first attempt to confront genocide. This legacy continues to influence international law today. The site of Bergen-Belsen has been preserved as a memorial, ensuring its lessons are not lost to time. Visitors walk the grounds, where grass now covers the mass graves that hold thousands of victims. The silence of the site is profound, broken only by the wind rustling through the trees. Memorial stones mark the burial sites, bearing names where names are known, and numbers where identities were erased. The Bergen-Belsen Memorial Museum provides context, displaying documents, photographs, and testimonies. It is not a place of spectacle, but of solemn reflection. Its purpose is not to shock, but to educate, to confront visitors with the reality of human cruelty and resilience. For survivors, the memorial became a sacred space where mourning could continue. For future generations, it is a classroom without walls, teaching the consequences of hatred. Bergen-Belsen's physical preservation is itself part of its enduring legacy. The legacy of Bergen-Belsen extends into the broader fight against Holocaust denial and distortion. In a world where falsehoods and revisionism can spread rapidly, sites like Belsen are crucial guardians of truth. The physical evidence of the camp, combined with survivor testimonies, forms an irrefutable record of what occurred. This legacy is essential in countering those who seek to erase or minimize the Holocaust. Bergen-Belsen stands as proof against the corrosive power of denial, a bulwark against forgetting. Its story is invoked whenever history itself is under attack, reminding us that truth must be defended. The camp's memory thus becomes a weapon against lies, ensuring that history remains anchored in evidence. Survivors often warned that the greatest danger was not hatred alone but indifference. To honor Belsen's legacy is to confront denial with vigilance. In doing so, humanity safeguards its moral compass. Bergen-Belsen's legacy is also deeply personal, carried in the trauma of survivors and their families. The camp left scars that could not heal in one lifetime. Nightmares, illnesses, and grief followed survivors long after liberation. Their children, too, bore the weight of inherited trauma, a reminder of the camp's enduring shadow. Yet many survivors rebuilt lives, raising families, contributing to communities, and striving for normalcy. Their resilience itself became a legacy, showing that life could emerge from devastation. Bergen-Belsen thus embodies both destruction and renewal. Survivors' successes became quiet acts of defiance against the Nazis' attempt to annihilate them. Their stories testify to the human spirit's capacity for endurance. This personal legacy is as vital as any memorial or trial. On a universal level, the legacy of Bergen-Belsen is a warning about the consequences of hatred, prejudice, and dehumanization. It reminds us that genocide does not begin with mass killings, but with words, stereotypes, and laws. Bergen-Belsen was not an accident, but the product of escalating intolerance allowed to thrive unchecked. Its story compels us to recognize danger signs in our own time: scapegoating, propaganda, and the erosion of human rights. The camp warns us of what can happen when ordinary people accept the unacceptable. Bergen-Belsen is not just a story of Germany in 1945, but a lesson for all nations and all times. Its legacy insists that humanity must remain vigilant against repeating past mistakes. The camp embodies the truth that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. To honor its victims is to act when hatred rises again. This is Bergen-Belsen's universal warning. Ultimately, the legacy of Bergen-Belsen is both a burden and a gift. It burdens us with the knowledge of what humans are capable of when cruelty is left unchecked. Yet it gifts us with the voices of survivors, the testimony of history, and the opportunity to learn. Bergen-Belsen reminds us that remembrance is not passive, it is active, requiring education, vigilance, and empathy. Its legacy is carved into the conscience of humanity, demanding that we look beyond indifference. To walk through its grounds is to walk through a graveyard of civilization's failures, but also to encounter resilience. Bergen-Belsen stands not only as a place of death, but as a source of moral instruction. Its memory insists that humanity can choose differently, that it must choose compassion over cruelty. This is the enduring lesson of Bergen-Belsen. Its legacy is not only history, it is humanity's guide for the future.